Welcome back to Background Historian. Before we drift into the story of the Great Schism, take a moment to settle into a comfortable space, let your breathing grow slow and steady, and allow the quiet of the evening to wrap gently around you. This series is a peaceful exploration of one of the most significant moments in Christian history, told not through conflict or tension, but through soft reflections on culture, language, theology, and time. Here, we move slowly through centuries of shared heritage, tracing how two ancient branches of the same faith gradually grew in different directions. Together, we will wander through old cities, listen to the voices of early Christian teachers, and watch the rhythms of East and West unfold like distant candle flames flickering in the dark. Let your mind relax as we begin, knowing that each part of this series is crafted to bring you comfort, rest, and deeper understanding as you drift toward sleep. Part 1. The Early Christian World, a gentle overview of the First Church. Long before any division existed between East and West, long before the idea of a Catholic Church or an Eastern Orthodox Church emerged, there was simply the early Christian world. It was a world without sharp borders, without formal hierarchies as we know them today, and without the complex structures that later centuries would build. Instead, it was a humble and quietly growing community, scattered across towns and cities of the Roman Empire, held together by shared faith, shared memory, and shared hope. In this first part of the series, let yourself drift into that ancient landscape. Imagine a world illuminated not by electric lights but by oil lamps, a world shaped by marketplaces, small houses, quiet gatherings, and whispered prayers in private rooms as Christianity began its journey. To understand the beginnings of the Christian Church, you must imagine the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century. The Roman Empire stretched across vast territories, touching North Africa, the Middle East, Greece, Italy, and parts of Western Europe. People moved along Roman roads, sailed across the Mediterranean, traded goods, exchanged news, and lived under the oversight of Roman governors and local authorities. Within this enormous mosaic of cultures, languages, and traditions, the earliest followers of Jesus gathered in small groups, meeting quietly in homes to share meals, prayers, and readings. These early communities were interconnected not through large cathedrals or political institutions, but through letters, travelers, and shared memory of the teachings of Christ. Life for early Christians was closer to the rhythm of nature than our modern world. Seasons dictated food, travel, and daily labor. Candles and lamps marked the passage of evening hours. Even in large cities like Corinth, Rome, or Alexandria, there was a softness to nightfall. Imagine the warm glow of lamps flickering against stone houses, the gentle murmur of water from a public fountain, and the slow hush settling over narrow streets. It was in these evening gatherings that Christians first prayed together, read letters from apostles, shared teachings, and reaffirmed their identity as a community bound together by love and humility. The earliest Christian communities were diverse in language and culture. Some spoke Aramaic, others Greek, and still others Latin or Coptic. Greek was the common language of much of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and so many of the earliest Christian writings, including the Gospels and letters of Paul, were written in Greek. This already planted the seeds of difference between the eastern and western parts of Christianity, though no one recognized it at the time. People simply used the languages they knew best. In the East, Greek shaped thought, philosophy, and theology. In the West, Latin gradually became the everyday tongue. For now, these differences lived peacefully side by side, like two gentle streams flowing from the same mountain. The early church had no grand buildings. Instead, it had households. A community might gather in the home of a wealthy member who could host many people. They would sit together, share bread, wine, prayers, and teachings passed down orally. There were disagreements from time to time, but they were handled through letters, travel, and personal visits from leaders like Paul or Peter. There was no sense of a Roman church or a Constantinopolitan church. There were simply communities, all united in their shared devotion and in their effort to follow the teachings of Christ in a world that did not always understand them. During these early centuries, Christians did not yet think in terms of East and West. Instead, they saw themselves as one body spread across the empire. Bishops emerged as community leaders, not as rulers but as shepherds who taught, settled disputes, and ensured harmony. Different regions developed slightly different customs. Some communities used one type of prayer, others used another. Some fasted on certain days, others did not. But these differences were small, gentle variations, much like slight changes in regional accents. Diversity was seen as natural, not troubling. The city of Jerusalem was especially important to early Christians. It was the place of Christ's death and resurrection and the home of the earliest apostles. Christians from all across the empire felt a spiritual pull toward Jerusalem, though it was not always the political or administrative center of the faith. Over time, as Christianity spread outward in waves, new centers of influence emerged, especially in cities where trade routes converged. Antioch in Syria, Alexandria in Egypt, and Rome in the West became major gathering points for Christian teachers, writers, and leaders. These cities would later become central to the story of the Schism, but in these early centuries they worked in harmony. In this early age, the Church was shaped more by shared experience than by institutional structure. There were persecutions at times, moments of fear, and episodes of uncertainty. Christians often felt the need to remain discreet to avoid attracting suspicion from Roman authorities who did not yet understand their practices. Yet even during hardships, the Church grew. Faith spread not through force but through quiet witness. Families converted together. Friends shared teachings with one another. Travelers carried news of Christianity across the Mediterranean. There was no rush. Growth came naturally, steadily, peacefully. Imagine sitting in an early Christian home one evening. The room is dimly lit by a small lamp. The scent of olive oil warms the air. People gather on simple woven mats or wooden stools. A reader unrolls a fresh letter from a nearby bishop or perhaps a copy of a gospel. The group listens attentively, absorbing each sentence slowly. The atmosphere is soft, intimate, and reverent. There is unity not based on power or control, but on shared devotion and mutual care. This sense of gentle unity is essential to understanding how the Christian Church began. Before any division, before theological disputes, before political tensions, the Church was simply a family of communities. It was united by belief in Christ, trust in the apostles, and the desire to live a moral and compassionate life. Although people lived in different regions, spoke different languages, and developed slightly different customs, they saw themselves as siblings in one spiritual household. And yet, even in these earliest centuries, small hints of future divergence could be found. Geography shaped identity. Rome sat in the Latin-speaking West, anchored in legal tradition. Constantinople, which would not become a major Christian center until the 4th century, lay in the Greek-speaking East, shaped by philosophy, art, and imperial presence. The East was comfortable with mysteries of theology expressed in symbolic, poetic language. The West preferred clarity, definitions, and legal formulations. These differences were not problems. They were simply gentle variations within a single shared world, like regional dialects spoken within the same family. As you drift into rest, picture the early Christian world not as a battleground of ideas, but as a quiet collection of homes and hearts. Imagine small gatherings, gentle prayers, and communities linked by love and hope rather than authority and conflict. The people of this early church had no notion of a coming division. They lived in the moment, embodying unity in the simplicity of shared meals, shared stories, and shared devotion. The story of the Schism begins here, in a time of harmony, simplicity, and peaceful diversity. In the next chapter, we will gently explore the two great cities that would one day become symbols of East and West, Rome and Constantinople. But for now, allow yourself to rest in this early world, where unity is natural, gentle, and unquestioned, and where the seeds of future differences lie quiet and dormant, waiting for centuries to unfold. Part 2. Rome and Constantinople, two cities, two cultures growing side by side. To understand how the Christian world gradually moved toward division, one must first wander slowly through the streets of the two great cities that came to symbolize the heart of the Church. Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east. These cities were not rivals at first, nor enemies, nor opposites. They were simply different, shaped by geography, culture, temperament, and history. In the quiet of night, imagine walking through each of them, letting the differences unfold gently like distant waves that would, over centuries, carve separate shores. Rome was ancient long before Christianity arrived. Its stones carried the memory of emperors, senators, and soldiers. Latin voices echoed through its marketplaces, and Roman law defined civic life. Even in the earliest centuries of the Church, Rome possessed a certain gravity, a sense of continuity and solidity. Christians in the West looked to Rome not only because tradition tied it to Peter and Paul, but because Rome had long been the beating heart of the empire. One could imagine early Christians approaching the city as pilgrims, hearing Latin prayers spoken in firm, measured tones, and sensing that Rome's identity was shaped by order, structure, and practicality. Its Christianity leaned toward clarity. It valued definitions, statements, and legal formulations when explaining matters of faith. This inclination was not rigid or harsh, but simply the natural extension of a culture that had long relied on law to bind together a vast empire. Constantinople, by contrast, was young when compared to Rome. Founded in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine, it rose from the ancient city of Byzantium like a new jewel of the empire. Built on the shores of the Bosporus, it was a city of shimmering waters, sea breezes, and graceful domes. While Rome carried the weight of antiquity, Constantinople represented a vision of the future. It was adorned with art, mosaics, and architecture influenced by centuries of Greek thought and culture. Its language was Greek, the tongue of philosophy, poetry, and theological nuance. In its churches, prayers and hymns drifted like music, carrying a contemplative and mystical quality. Constantinople's Christianity leaned toward symbolism, beauty, and the poetic expression of divine truths. Imagine standing on a quiet balcony overlooking Constantinople in the evening. Lanterns flicker along the harbor. The soft sound of waves brushes against the stone walls of the city. Music from a distant liturgy drifts through open windows, melodic and serene. The city feels intertwined with water, sky, and light. Faith here expresses itself in contemplation, beauty, and mystery. Theology is not merely stated but sung, painted, and woven into the rhythm of daily life. In Rome, the atmosphere was different but equally powerful. Walking through one of its early Christian gatherings, you might hear firm, steady preaching, practical counsel, and reflections grounded in the traditions of the apostolic community. Latin had a structure that lent itself to conciseness and definition. As the centuries passed, Rome became increasingly accustomed to serving as an anchor for Christian practice in the West. Its bishops found themselves called upon to settle disputes, clarify teachings, and provide guidance for far-flung communities. Rome was not yet the monarchical papacy the world would later know, but its importance was recognized even then as a stabilizing force. These differences between Rome and Constantinople did not create tension in the beginning. Instead, they simply reflected the natural diversity of a widespread and multicultural Christian world. The early church had no expectation that every region would look the same, worship the same, or express theology in the same manner. In the early centuries, each region developed its own liturgical customs, musical styles, and traditions. The seeds of different spiritual imaginations were already present, but they coexisted peacefully, much like different flowers blooming in the same garden. Yet geography shaped experience. Rome stood at the western edge of the empire, physically distant from many of the great theological debates of the East. Constantinople, on the other hand, lay close to the intellectual centers of Ansh, Alexandria, and Jerusalem. Its bishops participated directly in councils and discussions that would define the theology of the Christian faith. As a result, the East became the natural home for philosophical reflection on doctrine, while the West devoted itself to pastoral care, unity, and moral guidance. In Constantinople, one might imagine scholars gathered in candlelit rooms, scrolls unfurled before them, discussing the nature of Christ or the meaning of ancient creeds. Their conversations were rich with metaphor and philosophical depth. In Rome, bishops reflected on these teachings from a distance, approaching them through the lens of pastoral necessity. Their priority was often unity and clarity rather than speculation. The differing intellectual traditions complemented one another, but over centuries they began to drift apart slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Another difference between the cities emerged from their relationship to imperial authority. Rome, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, found itself without the support of an emperor. Its bishops gradually stepped into roles of civic leadership, caring for the poor, negotiating with invaders, and preserving stability during times of political collapse. Constantinople, however, remained the seat of imperial power. The Eastern Emperor saw himself not only as ruler of the empire but as protector of the Church. This connection between throne and altar created a unique environment in the East where spiritual and political authority coexisted in a delicate symphony. The emperor was not a priest, but he was deeply involved in religious matters. While this relationship often worked harmoniously, it also meant that the Bishop of Constantinople held influence that was intertwined with imperial favor. This difference in political environment shaped the developing identities of the two churches. Rome grew used to independence, forging its own traditions, standing firm in times of crisis, and gradually strengthening the position of its bishop. Constantinople grew within a world of imperial ceremony, intellectual exchange, and liturgical splendor, where the church and the state often worked together. Neither model was inherently better or worse. They were simply the natural expressions of two distinct worlds. As centuries passed, these gentle differences in culture, language, governance, and theological expression accumulated like layers of soft sediment. No single moment created division. Instead, separation grew so slowly that few noticed it happening. If you were to walk through Rome in the 6th century and then through Constantinople in the same year, you would recognize both as Christian cities, yet you would feel their differences. In Rome, worship might feel steady and reserved. In Constantinople, it might feel luminous and elaborate. In Rome, bishops might speak in practical, structured sentences. In Constantinople, they might speak with poetic flourish and philosophical reflection. Yet even as differences accumulated, unity remained. Rome and Constantinople respected each other deeply. They communicated through letters, councils, and envoys. They regarded themselves as guardians of the same faith and participants in the same ancient tradition. If tensions arose, they were often brief and resolved with care. These early centuries are best imagined not as a time of conflict but as a long, gentle divergence. The two cities stood like two great trees that had once grown from the same root system but gradually extended their branches toward different stretches of sky. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine Rome and Constantinople not as opposing forces but as two stories unfolding side by side. Each city bore the memory of Christ and the teachings of the apostles. Each cultivated beauty, devotion, and scholarship in its own way. Both were precious to the Christian world, and both believed firmly in their responsibility to preserve and deepen the faith. In the next part of our series, we will drift into the world of the early Church Fathers, those teachers and writers whose thoughts shaped Christianity's earliest centuries. Their influence spanned both East and West, binding the two worlds together even as subtle differences began to appear. Part 3. The Early Church Fathers, Shared Roots, Shared Teachings. As you settle into a place of rest, let your breathing slow and your thoughts drift softly toward the ancient world. In the quiet glow of candlelight, long before the Christian Church had formal divisions or opposing traditions, there lived a group of thinkers, teachers, and spiritual writers whose works shaped the very foundations of Christian belief. These were the early Church Fathers. Their voices rose from cities scattered across the Roman Empire, from Alexandria to Ansh, from Rome to Carthage, from Jerusalem to Constantinople. Though many lived centuries before the Great Schism, their writings offered the deep roots from which both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions would one day grow. To imagine them, picture a world where parchment is precious, where libraries smell of ink and dust, and where wisdom is passed down through careful copying, memorization, and storytelling. You might imagine an elderly writer seated beneath the soft light of a flickering oil lamp, gently dipping his quill and shaping letters slowly, deliberately. Another might be speaking to a small gathering of students in a quiet courtyard. Yet another might be traveling by ship, carrying scrolls carefully wrapped against the sea salt wind. Their world was quieter than ours, filled with slower rhythms and deep intellectual contemplation. What made the Church Fathers so influential was not only their intelligence but their sincerity. They were men who tried to articulate the mystery of faith with clarity, compassion, and humility. They did not imagine that their teachings would one day become points of debate between East and West. Instead, they saw themselves simply as guardians of an emerging tradition, seeking to explain the teachings of Jesus and the apostles amid the diverse and sometimes confusing religious landscape of the Roman Empire. Some of the earliest among them lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Ignatius of Ansh, for instance, wrote tender letters to Christian communities as he traveled toward martyrdom. In his words, we find both gentle resolve and deep affection. He encouraged unity, humility, and steadfastness. Around the same time, Clement of Rome wrote on harmony and cooperation, urging communities to remain peaceful and orderly. Both Ignatius and Clement are early reminders that the Church's beginnings were built on relationships rather than structures, on brotherhood and shared purpose rather than institutional power. As centuries passed, the Church Fathers became more numerous and their writings more extensive. They sought to explain theology, defend the faith against misunderstanding, and guide believers in moral and spiritual practices. Their works created a vast treasury of early Christian thought, one that both Eastern Orthodoxy and the Catholic Church still cherish. In fact, it is one of the most peaceful truths of Christian history that both branches look back to these same teachers as their spiritual ancestors. Before division, there was common inheritance. In Alexandria, a city famous for its libraries and scholars, thinkers like Origen and Athanasius developed theological reflections that shaped Christianity for centuries. Origen was known for his intellectual depth, exploring the symbolic meaning of Scripture and helping Christians understand how ancient texts spoke to spiritual experience. Athanasius defended the belief that Christ was fully divine at a time when this idea faced significant opposition. His writings, though complex, were rooted in a gentle conviction that faith could be both profound and deeply comforting. Farther north, in Cappadocia, three remarkable figures emerged: Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. Often called the Cappadocian Fathers, their writings beautifully combined philosophy, theology, and spirituality. Their reflections on the Trinity would shape both Eastern and Western Christianity. Basil wrote about community life, moderation, and service to the poor. Gregory of Nyssa explored the mystical aspects of faith, describing God as a deep mystery that draws the soul ever forward. Gregory of Nazianzus, known for his eloquence, wrote sermons and poems that read like serene meditations. Their influence on Eastern Orthodoxy is immense, yet their insights remain loved and honored in the West as well. In North Africa, Augustine of Hippo wrote with a voice that still resonates today. His works, particularly his contemplations on grace, human nature, and the inner life, became cornerstones for Western theology. His writings carried a gentle introspection, filled with moments of vulnerability and searching. One can imagine him in a quiet study late at night, reflecting on the struggles and hopes of the soul. Though Augustine's influence became especially strong in the Latin West, his writings were known and respected in the East as well. Long before any schism, his voice, like so many others, belonged to a shared Christian world. The Church Fathers wrote in different languages. Some wrote in Greek, others in Latin, and a few in Syriac or Coptic. Yet this diversity did not fracture the Church. Instead, it enriched it. Greek writers explored theology through philosophical language, often emphasizing mystery, beauty, and spiritual ascent. Latin writers preferred clarity, structure, and practical moral guidance. These tendencies, visible even in the earliest centuries, were not sources of tension but reflections of the empire's cultural diversity. Imagine the flow of letters and manuscripts traveling across the Roman world. A bishop in Rome might receive a theological treatise from Alexandria. A scholar in Constantinople might read a Latin translation of Augustine's latest book. A monk copying manuscripts in Palestine might preserve the writings of both Eastern and Western teachers in the same collection. The Church Fathers did not live in isolation. They influenced one another, responded to one another, and wove together a shared tapestry of early Christian thought. Their writings addressed questions that would remain central to Christianity. How do we understand Christ? How do we interpret Scripture? How should Christians live, pray, and serve others? And how do we describe the relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Though later disagreements would arise, these early teachers laid the foundations for doctrines that both East and West still affirm. The Nicene Creed, for example, emerged from conversations and debates that involved Church Fathers from all across the empire. It became a symbol of unity before it became a point of later contention. If you close your eyes, you might imagine the quiet of a monastery where monks preserved these writings. The gentle scratch of quills across parchment fills the air. Outside, a breeze rustles the leaves. The atmosphere is peaceful, contemplative, devoted to preserving knowledge. For centuries, this was how the wisdom of the Church Fathers survived, through careful copying in places of silence and prayer. These monks were not thinking of East or West. They were simply preserving the spiritual heritage entrusted to them. In the soft glow of these early centuries, the writings of the Church Fathers formed a bridge that united Christians across vast distances. Long before disputes arose, these teachings were the shared compass by which believers oriented their faith. East and West both drank deeply from the same well. The Fathers spoke to every corner of the Christian world, offering pastoral comfort, spiritual depth, and theological guidance. As you drift deeper toward sleep, imagine the early Christian world as a quiet library of voices: Greek, Latin, Eastern, Western, poetic, logical, mystical, practical, all harmonizing before the slow approach of division. Their teachings were the foundation upon which both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions would stand. They remind us that unity once lived naturally within diversity, and that the roots of the Christian tradition were shared long before branches began to grow in different directions. In the next part of the series, we will explore one of the earliest and gentlest sources of difference, the way language itself shaped theology, culture, and imagination in the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. Part 4. Language and thought. Latin West and Greek East slowly grow apart. As the early Christian centuries unfolded, something subtle and almost imperceptible began to take shape within the vast and varied world of the Roman Empire. It was not a conflict, nor a disagreement, nor anything that people of the time would have described as a division. It was simply the quiet influence of language, slowly shaping the way people thought, worshipped, prayed, and understood the mysteries of their faith. In this part of our series, we drift gently into the world of Latin and Greek, not as competing forces, but as two distinct melodies that harmonized for centuries before gradually drifting into separate rhythms. To appreciate how deeply language shapes thought, imagine sitting in two different churches in the 4th century. In the West, you might hear the steady cadence of Latin prayers, structured, firm, clear. The sound of Latin has a certain weight to it, a sense of order and definition. Each word feels distinct and grounded, like stones carefully laid to form a steady path. Latin was the language of law, governance, and precise meaning. Its sentences tended to be compact and disciplined, shaped by centuries of Roman administration and legal tradition. When Latin-speaking Christians prayed or reflected on theology, their language gently guided them toward clarity, definition, and rational structure. Now imagine the East, where Greek filled the air. Greek has a musical fluidity, with soft consonants and long vowels that allow sentences to stretch and flow. Greek was the language of philosophy and poetry, of metaphors and layered meanings. When Greek-speaking Christians spoke about God, their language allowed subtlety and nuance to blossom. A single Greek term might hold multiple shades of meaning, and philosophical concepts could intertwine with imagery in ways that lifted theological reflection into a kind of contemplative art. Greek shaped the imagination of the Eastern Church, allowing it to explore mystery not by defining it, but by lingering within it. For many centuries, these differences were not sources of tension. Instead, they enriched the Church, providing two lenses through which to understand the same truths. Latin emphasized simplicity and order. Greek emphasized depth and beauty. Western theologians tended to describe doctrine using concise statements, while Eastern theologians often reflected on the same truths through poetic or symbolic expression. Both approaches were valuable, like two hands holding the same treasure. Yet language does more than communicate. It shapes how people think. It influences how they interpret the world and how they express their deepest beliefs. Over generations, the subtle differences between Latin and Greek began to form distinct theological habits. Latin Christians spoke about God using terms that echoed legal frameworks, words like substance, nature, and person framed in a structured way. Greek Christians, drawing on philosophical traditions that reached back to Plato and Aristotle, used terms like essence, hypostasis, and energies with rich, almost poetic subtlety. These were not contradictory approaches. They were simply different paths through the same forest. Imagine a group of early theologians gathered in a quiet room, perhaps in ancient Rome, discussing the nature of Christ. A Latin speaker might use terms that bring clarity and stability, hoping to define boundaries so that errors can be avoided. A Greek speaker might use terms that invite contemplation, hoping to guard the sense of mystery while still guiding the mind toward truth. Neither was wrong. Both were seeking understanding. Yet because theology was being shaped by two distinct linguistic traditions, readers centuries later would sometimes misunderstand one another, not because they disagreed in doctrine, but because their words carried different connotations. These linguistic differences were not immediately visible to everyday believers. Most Christians lived their lives unaware of the philosophical nuances embedded in their prayers. They attended church, celebrated feasts, raised families, and honored God according to the customs of their community. But in the world of theologians, bishops, and monastic teachers, language gradually created parallel patterns of thought. Over time, Eastern Christianity developed an emphasis on mystical experience, theosis, and the contemplative vision of God's presence. Western Christianity, shaped by Latin's precision, developed a stronger focus on rational explanation, moral clarity, and pastoral order. This is not to say that the East lacked logic or that the West lacked mysticism. Both traditions held these qualities in abundance. But the balance shifted differently in each world, like two branches growing from the same trunk but bending slightly in different directions because of the wind, the light, and the soil surrounding them. The distance between Latin and Greek also grew geographically. As communication became more difficult between East and West, linguistic differences deepened. Translators often struggled to carry complex theological terms across languages. A Greek phrase might lose its richness in Latin translation, while a Latin phrase might gain unintended nuance when rendered in Greek. Misunderstandings at councils sometimes arose not from disagreement but from imperfect translation. An issue that would echo through centuries. Meanwhile, the everyday rhythms of worship became shaped by language as well. In the East, hymns developed into long, melodic compositions, filled with symbolism and theological imagery. Chanting became an essential part of the liturgy. In the West, hymns tended to be shorter, simpler, and more structured, echoing the Latin preference for clarity and order. Even artwork reflected the dual influence of language and culture. Eastern icons used symbolic and stylized imagery to convey spiritual truths. Western art leaned toward realism, narrative scenes, and emotional expression. The difference was gentle, but noticeable, and it flowed naturally from the linguistic worlds in which each tradition lived. Imagine walking through an Eastern church in the 7th century. The interior glows with candlelight. Icons shimmer with gold leaf, not as decorations but as windows into the divine. The liturgy unfolds like a slow, unfolding poem. Language and music blend into a single, contemplative experience. Meanwhile, in a Western church, the atmosphere feels steady and grounded. The liturgy is structured, rhythmic, and aligned with the Roman sense of order. The focus is on unity, moral clarity, and the pastoral guidance of the faithful. Both are beautiful. Both are ancient. Both are holy. But they are not identical. By the time centuries passed, these linguistic and cultural differences had created two distinct but fully Christian worlds. People did not yet think of themselves as Catholic or Orthodox. Those terms would come later. But they did have a sense that customs, prayers, and theological reflections differed across regions. These differences were accepted peacefully, like regional dialects in a family that still shares the same home. No one imagined that these gentle divergences would one day contribute to a profound separation. As you drift more deeply into rest, imagine these two languages, Latin and Greek, like two soft voices singing different verses of the same ancient hymn. They harmonize beautifully, sometimes overlapping, sometimes drifting apart, but always sharing the same heart. The division between the churches did not begin with conflict. It began with language, slowly and quietly shaping worlds of thought that were still united by faith. In the next part of our series, we will explore how leadership structures formed in the early church, and how the roles of bishops and patriarchs gradually developed within this diverse and multilingual Christian world. Part 5. The Rise of the Patriarchs, How Leadership Structures Took Shape. As you settle a bit deeper into rest, allow your mind to drift into the early centuries of the Christian world, a time when the Church was still finding its shape, still discovering how best to guide its growing communities, and still learning how to organize itself across vast lands and many languages. There were no popes in the modern sense yet, no formalized patriarchates with strict boundaries, and no rigid hierarchies. Instead, there was an organic, gradual emergence of leadership that reflected the rhythm of the world at the time, shaped by geography, culture, and the slow, steady expansion of Christian life. To begin understanding how the patriarchs rose to prominence, imagine the Christian Church spread across the Roman Empire like a constellation of gentle lights. Each community had its own bishop, a shepherd responsible for teaching, leading prayer, settling disputes, and serving as a moral compass. Bishops were not viewed as rulers. Rather, they were trusted elders, selected from within their communities, respected for their wisdom and character. They worked closely with priests, deacons, and devoted laypeople, weaving together the fabric of early Christian life. But as Christianity grew, some cities naturally gained greater influence. These cities had long been centers of learning, trade, governance, or cultural exchange. Christians looked to them the way a traveler looks toward a lighthouse on a distant shore. Not because they demanded authority, but because they radiated stability, knowledge, and continuity. Rome was one of those cities. As the old capital of the empire in the west and the site associated with the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, Rome held a quiet yet powerful weight within Christian imagination. People believed that the Bishop of Rome bore a special responsibility, rooted not in political dominance but in apostolic heritage. The idea of Rome as a first among equals grew slowly and gently over centuries, more as a recognition of honor than of jurisdiction. In the east, other important cities rose alongside Rome. Alexandria, with its majestic libraries and scholarly tradition, became known for its theological depth and monastic wisdom. The Bishop of Alexandria oversaw a vast Christian population across Egypt, and his influence extended far beyond the city's borders. Ansh, one of the first centers of Christian missionary activity, was a place where both Jewish and Gentile believers lived side by side. Its bishops helped shape Christian identity in Syria and beyond. Then there was Jerusalem, the spiritual birthplace of Christianity. Though smaller politically, its symbolic weight was immeasurable. Christians everywhere looked toward the city where Christ had lived, died, and risen. The Bishop of Jerusalem, even if not administratively powerful, was honored for leading the most sacred ground in the Christian imagination. Yet the most transformative addition came in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine moved the imperial capital to a small city on the Bosporus and renamed it Constantinople. With a single decision, the map of Christian leadership began to shift. Constantinople quickly grew into a magnificent city, filled with palaces, churches, and scholars. As the new political heart of the empire, it was only natural that its bishop would begin to play a larger role in ecclesiastical affairs. Still, this was not a sudden rise. It was a slow unfolding, shaped by the gentle yet persistent pull of imperial presence. As centuries passed, the bishops of these major cities, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, came to be known as patriarchs, a term of honor that conveyed seniority and responsibility. They were seen as guardians of tradition, interpreters of theology, and shepherds of vast regions of the Christian world. Their roles grew not out of ambition but out of necessity. Local communities looked to them for clarity during theological disputes, for unity during political upheaval, and for guidance when new questions arose about faith and practice. But even as these patriarchs emerged, the Church did not immediately view leadership in terms of strict hierarchy. The idea of a single supreme authority did not yet exist. Instead, leadership was understood as a chorus, with each patriarch holding equal dignity but different responsibilities. Rome was honored for its apostolic legacy. Constantinople gained distinction because of its political importance. Alexandria and Antioch were valued for their scholarly traditions and missionary heritage. Jerusalem was cherished for its sacred history. They were like 5 great pillars supporting the early Christian world. In the West, the Bishop of Rome gradually came to be regarded as the successor of Peter in a special sense. The West admired order, clarity, and unity, and so it was natural for Western Christians to look toward Rome as a symbolic center. In the East, however, authority was viewed more collaboratively. The Eastern Church saw the patriarchs as working together in harmony, each contributing to the unity of the faith through mutual respect and shared responsibility. This difference in how authority was understood would one day become one of the quiet threads contributing to the schism, but in these early centuries, it was simply a gentle variation in thought. Imagine a council taking place in one of these great cities. Bishops from across the region gather under a warm evening sky. Their conversations are thoughtful, patient, and rooted in prayer. Letters travel across the empire, carrying theological questions, proposed solutions, or requests for guidance. In Rome, a bishop might write to Alexandria seeking clarity on a doctrinal issue. In Constantinople, theologians might consult on interpretations of Scripture. Though disagreements arose, the atmosphere was usually one of collaboration. They saw themselves as guardians of a unified faith, working together to preserve the teachings they had inherited. The patriarchs also played vital roles during moments of crisis. When theological controversies shook the Church, whether about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, or the interpretation of Scripture, the patriarchs provided leadership. They convened councils, debated ideas, and drafted statements that guided believers through confusion. Their cooperation shaped the creeds and canons that both East and West still recite today. Even when disagreements later emerged between these ancient sees, the memory of shared roots remained woven into the heart of Christian tradition. Monasticism also played a role in shaping the authority of the patriarchs. In the East, monks often served as spiritual advisors to bishops and emperors alike. Their devotion to prayer and asceticism gave them spiritual authority, and patriarchs frequently consulted them. In the West, the Bishop of Rome also worked closely with monastic communities, particularly those who preserved texts, taught literacy, and offered stability during political instability. This collaboration strengthened the bonds between church leadership and everyday Christian life. As centuries passed, the patriarchal system became more formal. Canon law recognized the honor of Rome as the first among patriarchs. Constantinople, as the new Rome, was granted a place of special prominence in the East. Alexandria, Ansh, and Jerusalem maintained their ancient dignity. The structure was not perfect. There were disagreements, debates, and moments of tension. But overall, the patriarchal system helped the Church maintain unity across immense distances. Picture the world at the time. Vast deserts stretching across Egypt, snow-capped mountains in Anatolia, bustling ports along the Mediterranean coast, and dense forests in the Balkans. Across all these landscapes, Christians prayed, worked, and lived guided by the gentle leadership of 5 great patriarchal sees. It was a system born not from power struggles but from centuries of cooperation, mutual respect, and shared responsibility. As you drift deeper toward rest, imagine the patriarchs as ancient lanterns placed at 5 cardinal points of the Christian world, casting light across lands and seas. Their glow was steady, peaceful, and united. They were not yet divided by the misunderstandings and tensions that would later arise. Instead, they stood together, helping shepherd the Church through its most formative centuries. In the next part of our series, we will explore the great councils and creeds that emerged from this age of unified leadership, shaping Christian doctrine in ways that both Rome and Constantinople continue to honor. Part 6. Councils and Creeds, the shared foundations of faith. As the Christian Church continued to grow through the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, it faced questions that were larger than any one bishop, city, or congregation could answer alone. These questions were not simply intellectual puzzles. They touched upon the very heart of Christian belief: who is Christ? How is God revealed to humanity? What does it mean for God to be one, and yet for Christians to speak of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? These were profound mysteries, and early Christians felt a deep and sincere obligation to approach them with reverence, caution, and unity. To address such questions, the Church developed a practice that would become one of the most important features of its early centuries: the ecumenical council. The word ecumenical meant universal or pertaining to the whole inhabited world. When a council was called, bishops from all across the Roman Empire would travel to a designated city to pray, debate, listen, and discern together. These gatherings were never quick or simple. They unfolded over months, sometimes years, and they took place not in grand halls but in churches, basilicas, and modest public buildings filled with the warm glow of oil lamps and the quiet murmur of translation. Before drifting further, imagine the scene of one of these early councils. A large church in a city like Nicaea or Chalcedon, its stone walls cool even in summer heat. Bishops from distant lands arrive wearing simple robes, some travel-worn, some elderly, some carrying the spiritual weight of entire regions on their shoulders. The sound of different languages mingles in the air: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, creating a gentle hum of conversation. Outside, the city continues its daily rhythms, but inside the council halls, the atmosphere is solemn, contemplative, and deeply prayerful. It was at these councils that the Church Fathers worked together to articulate the doctrines that now lie at the heart of both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. The most famous of these gatherings was the First Council of Nicaea in 325. Called by Emperor Constantine, this council addressed a controversy about the nature of Christ. Was the Son truly divine, or was he a created being, exalted yet not equal to the Father? The question had caused confusion and unrest in Christian communities, and the council sought to restore clarity and unity. The bishops at Nicaea did not approach this task as philosophers seeking victory in debate. They approached it as shepherds seeking to protect their flocks. They prayed for guidance. They listened to one another. They reviewed scripture and tradition. And from this council emerged the first form of the Nicene Creed, a statement of faith that affirmed Christ as true God from true God, fully divine, begotten, not made, sharing the same divine essence as the Father. The crafting of this creed was not a moment of division between East and West. It was a moment of profound unity. Bishops from both halves of the empire contributed to it. They saw it not as a tool for enforcement, but as a gift for clarity. A poetic yet precise summary of belief that the entire Church could confess together. For centuries, this creed would be recited in churches from Rome to Constantinople, from Alexandria to Antioch, like a shared heartbeat of Christian identity. After Nicaea came other councils, Constantinople in 381, Ephesus in 431, Chalcedon in 451, and several others in later centuries. Each one addressed questions that required collective wisdom. At Constantinople, the divinity of the Holy Spirit was affirmed, completing the early Church's articulation of the Trinity. At Ephesus, the Church upheld its understanding of Mary as Theotokos, the God-bearer, protecting the unity of Christ's divinity and humanity. At Chalcedon, the Church clarified that Christ was both fully divine and fully human, two natures united harmoniously in one person. These councils were not easy. They involved long discussions, passionate disagreements, and the difficulties that arise whenever sincere, intelligent people attempt to articulate ineffable mysteries. But despite the challenges, something remarkable happened. The councils brought unity. They produced teachings that both East and West continue to honor as foundational truths. The creeds and canons that emerged from these gatherings still echo through liturgies, prayers, and theological reflections in both churches today. As you rest, imagine the deep sense of relief that Christians must have felt when a council reached agreement. After years of confusion, division, or uncertainty, there came clarity, not perfect clarity, because no human words can fully capture divine mysteries, but enough clarity for communities to move forward in peace. These councils did not erase diversity. Christians still spoke different languages, celebrated different customs, and emphasized different aspects of theology. But the councils provided a shared vocabulary, a shared confession, a shared map of belief. The ecumenical councils also reveal something gentle and beautiful about the early Church, its willingness to listen. Bishops traveled great distances, sometimes through dangerous conditions, risking illness, hardship, or fatigue, not to argue but to discern. They trusted that truth was not held by one region alone but was revealed in the collective wisdom of the whole Christian world. Even when theological differences emerged, the councils showed a sincere desire for unity, a desire rooted not in force but in love. In the West, the decisions of the councils were cherished as authoritative teachings that provided needed structure and stability. In the East, the councils became woven into liturgical life, with their creed sung or recited during worship. Both traditions saw the councils as moments of blessed clarity, where the Church spoke with a unified voice. This shared reverence for the councils became one of the strongest bonds between East and West, long before misunderstandings would cloud the relationship. Yet even in this period of unity, small differences began to appear. The West tended to emphasize legal language when interpreting conciliar decisions, seeing them as binding definitions meant to safeguard orthodoxy. The East, shaped by its contemplative and mystical temperament, often viewed conciliar teachings as reflections of a deeper, living truth that continued to unfold within the life of the Church. These were not contradictory approaches, but complementary ones. They revealed the diverse ways Christians lived and understood their faith. As time passed, translations of conciliar documents circulated across the empire. Latin-speaking Christians read Greek texts in Latin versions. Greek-speaking Christians read Latin statements translated into Greek. While the translations were generally careful, some terms did not carry perfectly across languages. A Latin word might appear slightly rigid when rendered into Greek, while a Greek phrase might seem overly nuanced when translated into Latin. These small linguistic differences, hardly noticeable at the time, would later contribute to misunderstandings. But in the centuries we now rest within, none of these differences overshadowed unity. The councils were moments of immense harmony. They were the Church's way of breathing together, of inhaling questions and exhaling answers that brought peace. The Nicene Creed, which came from these gatherings, became a shared prayer not just of Christians in the 4th century, but of Christians today. Its words have lulled thousands into sleep, strengthened millions in faith, and echoed through countless churches across time. As you drift deeper into relaxation, imagine the ancient bishops returning home from a council. Ships gliding across calm seas. Horses carrying scrolls along dusty roads. Letters announcing decisions to distant congregations. Joyful relief sweeping through communities that had waited anxiously for guidance. Unity restored. Hope renewed. A shared future embraced. In the next part of our series, we will look at how the role of the Bishop of Rome gradually evolved, and how the West's understanding of the papacy slowly began to differ from the East's more collaborative model of leadership. Part 7. The role of the Roman Pope, early ideas of primacy. As night settles softly around you, let your thoughts drift back into the early centuries of the Christian world, a time when the rhythms of the Church were still taking shape and when Christians across vast distances looked to familiar cities for spiritual guidance. In the West, one city in particular carried a quiet but powerful gravity: Rome. Its bishop would one day become known as the Pope, a title that evokes an entire system of leadership. But before this title carried the weight it holds today, the role of the Bishop of Rome grew slowly, naturally, and almost imperceptibly over centuries, shaped by tradition, necessity, and the unfolding story of the Christian faith. To understand the Pope's early role, imagine Rome not as the grand medieval papacy of later centuries, but as a city filled with memories. It had been the capital of the empire, the center of law and civic life, and the heart of Western culture. Even after the imperial court shifted east to Constantinople, Rome retained symbolic importance. Its streets were lined with ancient monuments, and its Christian community traced its roots to two of the most honored apostles, Peter and Paul. Their graves lay within the city, and their presence, even centuries after their deaths, shaped the spiritual imagination of Christians everywhere. Early Christians believed that Peter held a special role among the apostles. He was often listed first in the Gospels, he was entrusted with leadership at key moments, and in Christian memory, he became associated with strength, steadfastness, and foundational authority. Because Peter was believed to have ministered and died in Rome, the community there felt a deep connection to his legacy. The Bishop of Rome inherited this spiritual association. Not as a monarch, but as a guardian of apostolic memory. In a world where tradition held great weight, being the successor of Peter carried a solemn and cherished significance. In the earliest centuries, the Bishop of Rome did not rule over the whole church. Instead, he served as a voice that communities trusted when disputes arose. Letters from Rome were often seen as stabilizing forces, offering clarity and encouragement. Even bishops in faraway lands might reach out to Rome during times of uncertainty. Rome's reputation for steadfastness created a sense that its bishop was uniquely positioned to preserve unity, especially during theological storms. Yet it is important to imagine this early papal role gently, without the later structures of papal authority overshadowing it. There was no central bureaucracy, no universal canon law, no conception of the papacy as a global administrative hierarchy. The early popes were humble figures who saw themselves primarily as servants of the church, not rulers above it. Their influence grew because others respected them, not because they demanded obedience. This early atmosphere was marked by mutual love and shared responsibility among bishops. As Christianity spread across the West, Rome became increasingly important simply because of geography. The western half of the empire relied on Latin, and there were fewer major cities with the long theological traditions found in the east. Alexandria, Ansh, and later Constantinople all had deep intellectual and spiritual roots. But in the West, Rome stood alone as the central pillar. When theological or pastoral issues emerged in Western churches, Rome became the natural place to seek guidance. Imagine receiving a letter from the Bishop of Rome in the 4th or 5th century. The parchment would be carefully sealed, the script often written in Latin, its tone gentle, pastoral, and concerned for unity. The letter might address questions about doctrine, discipline, or moral guidance. It might encourage charity, humility, or forgiveness within a community facing internal conflict. What mattered most was not authority but trust. Christians valued Rome's voice because it had proven reliable through times of hardship. Even in the East, Rome's role was honored, though understood differently. Eastern bishops respected Rome's connection to Peter, recognizing it as a place of special dignity. Council documents from the early centuries speak of Rome as first among the patriarchs, a phrase that conveyed honor and seniority without implying absolute supremacy. To the Eastern mind, leadership in the church was collegial. Patriarchs worked together, each with a distinct role, none possessing unilateral authority over the others. Rome was the eldest patriarch, but still one of several. This difference in perspective, honor versus jurisdiction, would later become one of the threads that contributed to division. But in the early centuries, it did not create conflict. Christians viewed these distinctions as natural variations in temperament and culture. The East valued a symphony of voices. The West valued unity under a single, stabilizing figure. Neither side believed they were in contradiction. They were simply living out their faith in the ways most natural to their respective worlds. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century significantly shaped the papacy's development. As Rome and other Western cities faced turmoil, political fragmentation, economic decline, and invasions, the Bishop of Rome gradually stepped into roles the imperial government could no longer fulfill. Popes negotiated with invading tribes, distributed aid, organized defenses, and cared for the poor. They became protectors not only of faith but of civic stability. This expanded their influence, not by ambition, but by necessity. Imagine Rome during this time. The once great city was diminished but still dignified. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Forums grew quiet. Many ancient buildings stood half-ruined, overtaken by vegetation. Within this fragile world, the Bishop of Rome walked among the people as a shepherd in the truest sense. His leadership became essential for survival, and communities far beyond the city looked to him for moral courage and guidance. This era planted the seeds of a stronger papal identity in the West, one shaped by resilience, service, and the responsibility to hold together a world unraveling at the edges. Meanwhile, the East lived under very different conditions. Constantinople remained strong, a thriving imperial capital protected by massive walls and supported by a stable government. The Patriarch there worked alongside emperors in an environment where church and state intertwined more visibly. Because the East never lost its political center, its bishops did not need to assume secular responsibilities the way Rome did. This contrast between an embattled West and a politically stable East gradually shaped differing expectations of church leadership. Despite these differences, the early papacy existed in a world still deeply united. Popes attended councils, collaborated with Eastern patriarchs, and honored the shared creeds. When disputes arose, they were usually resolved through dialogue and correspondence. No one imagined a future where East and West would be permanently separated. The Church still breathed with two lungs, nourished by a single faith. As centuries passed, Rome's understanding of its own role continued to evolve. Popes increasingly described themselves as successors not just to Peter but to a universal shepherding responsibility. Eastern bishops acknowledged Rome's seniority yet maintained an understanding of equality among patriarchs. These are subtle differences, gentle divergences of emphasis rather than overt disagreements. But as history shows, even gentle divergences can deepen when shaped by political changes, cultural distance, or theological nuance. As you drift deeper toward rest, imagine the early popes not as distant monarchs but as humble pastors tending a fragile and diverse flock. Picture them writing letters, praying with communities, welcoming refugees, and striving to hold together a church spread across continents. Their primacy was rooted in service, not dominance. Their strength lay in love, not coercion. In the next part of our series, we will gently cross into the Eastern world and explore how emperors, patriarchs, and monastic communities shaped the unique symphony of leadership in Byzantium. Part 8. The Eastern Emperors and Church Leadership, Symphony between Crown and Altar. As the soft quiet of evening settles around you, let your thoughts drift eastward across the ancient world, toward the shimmering lights of Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium. Here, the Christian Church grew in a world unlike the one in the West. It developed alongside emperors, imperial courts, scholars, and artists. To understand the slow movement toward the Great Schism, we must fall gently into this Eastern world, where the relationship between emperor and patriarch shaped the rhythm of Christian life for 1,000 years. In the East, the Roman Empire endured long after it crumbled in the West. Constantinople, with its towering walls and bustling harbors, became a place where spiritual and political life intertwined. The emperor, clothed not only in royal garments but in symbolic significance, played a role that no Western ruler ever could. He was not a priest, nor did he claim spiritual authority in matters of doctrine. Yet he was believed to be chosen by God to protect the Church, support its mission, and uphold unity. The East saw emperor and church as partners, two harmonizing voices in a single, sacred symphony. To understand this symphony, imagine the great palace of Constantinople at dawn. Sunlight glows softly across its marble floors. Courtiers move quietly through its corridors. Beyond its walls lies the grand Hagia Sophia, the church's crown jewel, its massive dome floating like a halo above the city. In this atmosphere, the emperor and patriarch lived not as rivals but as collaborators, each contributing to the governance and well-being of the Christian world. The Patriarch of Constantinople, while not claiming apostolic origins like Rome, held immense influence because his city was the imperial capital. The Church in the East valued hierarchy, but not a singular head. Instead, leadership flowed through a network of patriarchs, bishops, and monastic communities. Within this structure, the Patriarch of Constantinople naturally gained prominence, not by authority over others, but by his proximity to the emperor and to the political heart of the empire. This close connection between church and empire shaped the Eastern Christian imagination. While the West gradually grew accustomed to independence from imperial power, the East lived in a world infused with imperial presence. Councils were often convened by emperors. Theological debates unfolded in the hallways of palaces. Edicts affecting church life carried imperial seals. Yet these actions were not seen as overreach. Instead, they reflected a belief that emperor and church formed a partnership ordained by God. Sleep gently as you imagine this partnership. Picture an emperor consulting a patriarch on matters of faith, or a patriarch offering guidance to an emperor in times of crisis. Their roles were distinct but deeply interwoven. The East called this principle symphonia, a harmonious cooperation between earthly authority and heavenly guidance. It was a relationship rooted in mutual respect and the belief that empire and church were two hands working in service of a single divine purpose. In the West, such a relationship was impossible. The collapse of Western Roman political structures meant that the Bishop of Rome gradually filled roles once held by emperors. But in the East, the emperor was ever present, strong, and steady. This difference created two very different patterns of church leadership. Neither were superior. They were simply shaped by the landscapes in which they grew. The Eastern emperors saw themselves as guardians of orthodoxy. When controversies arose, they often summoned councils to seek clarity and unity. They did not compose doctrine but supported the bishops who did. Their presence at councils was symbolic, representing the care of a Christian ruler for his people. Yet this involvement sometimes created tensions. A strong emperor could influence ecclesiastical decisions, for good or for difficulty. Still, the East viewed this relationship as natural, believing that God had placed the empire under the emperor's stewardship for the protection of the faith. Imagine an emperor entering the Hagia Sophia during a solemn liturgy. Incense rises in glowing swirls toward the dome. Choirs chant hymns that echo across the marble. The patriarch stands with clergy in shimmering vestments. The emperor does not lead the liturgy, but he is honored as a servant of God's order. In this sacred space, political authority bows before divine majesty, and the Church embraces the emperor as one who sustains stability and harmony. This Eastern pattern shaped theology as much as it shaped governance. With the emperor as a stabilizing force, the Church in the East felt comfortable cultivating a deeply contemplative and mystical spiritual tradition. Monasteries thrived. Icons became central to worship. Hymnography, liturgical poetry, and theological reflection blossomed. The East developed a spirituality that saw the entire world suffused with divine presence, a place where the emperor, patriarch, monks, and faithful participated in the same cosmic liturgy. Yet this harmony was not without its delicate moments. Some emperors became too involved in theological matters, leading to conflicts such as the iconoclastic controversies, where imperial decrees attempted to regulate the use of icons in worship. These periods created tension between emperor and church, revealing the risks of a partnership so intertwined. But even in these challenging times, the East remained committed to the ideal of symphonia, believing that church and empire could achieve harmony through dialogue and mutual respect. Meanwhile, in the West, the papacy was growing in influence precisely because emperors were absent. As Roman bishops negotiated with invading tribes, protected the poor, and maintained social order, their spiritual authority expanded. Rome's isolation from imperial power strengthened its independence. The East, by contrast, grew accustomed to cooperation with emperors. These contrasting developments created two distinct understandings of leadership. The West gravitated towards centralized authority in a single figure. The East embraced collaborative leadership shared among patriarchs and guided by emperors. These differences were not immediate sources of conflict. For centuries, Rome and Constantinople maintained correspondence, collaborated in councils, and spoke of each other with respect. Yet their leadership models, and the worlds that shaped them, grew increasingly distant. Rome could not imagine a church where emperors played such a prominent role. Constantinople could not imagine a church where one bishop held ultimate authority over all others. As you drift deeper into calm, it becomes easier to see how these differences were not born of disagreement, but of environment. Geography, politics, language, and culture guided the development of two Christian worlds. The East prized harmony between sacred and secular. The West prized spiritual independence. The East thrived under imperial stability. The West grew through resilience in the face of political collapse. Both paths were sincere. Both sought unity. Both preserved the faith with devotion. And yet, without anyone intending it, the structures of leadership grew apart, like two branches extending slowly from the same trunk, shaped by different winds and different sunlight. In the next part of our series, we will explore how cultural drift, not conflict, began to influence art, liturgy, music, and theology, gently shaping two identities that remained united in faith but increasingly distinct in expression. Part 9. Cultural drift, art, liturgy, music, and architecture diverge. As evening deepens and the world grows quiet around you, let your thoughts drift gently into the heart of the early Christian world, where two great traditions, Eastern and Western, lived in harmony yet slowly began to form their own unique cultural identities. This was not a time of conflict or competition. Instead, it was a long, peaceful drifting apart, shaped by art, music, architecture, liturgy, and the rhythms of everyday worship. These differences unfolded across centuries, almost unnoticed by those living through them, like two rivers beginning as one and then gently curving into separate channels as they flow toward the horizon. To understand this gradual divergence, imagine yourself standing in a Christian church somewhere in the East during the 7th or 8th century. Perhaps you are in Ansh, Constantinople, or Thessaloniki. Entering the church, you feel the coolness of polished marble beneath your feet. Soft light filters through high windows, illuminating frescoes that shimmer with rich colors, deep blues, warm reds, and radiant gold leaf that glows like sunlight trapped within stone. Icons adorn the walls, not as decorations but as windows to the divine, each face painted with calm, contemplative eyes that seem to gaze gently into eternity. In this Eastern space, the air is filled with the scent of incense rising in slow, curling streams. A choir chants soft hymns in Greek, the language flowing with a musical, almost poetic rhythm. The liturgy unfolds with a sense of timelessness. Chant, prayer, gesture, and silence weave together into an atmosphere of deep mystery. Worshippers do not rush. They move gently, crossing themselves, bowing slightly, letting the beauty of the moment envelop them. In the East, liturgy is an experience of being carried upward into a sacred world, one where the boundary between heaven and earth feels thin, almost permeable. Now imagine yourself far away in the West, perhaps in Rome, Milan, or Ravenna. The church you enter feels different, not in holiness but in character. The architecture is sturdy and grounded. Columns of stone support a heavy roof. The art tends to be more narrative, depicting scenes from Scripture or the lives of saints in ways that speak directly to the mind and heart. The murals and mosaics are beautiful, but the faces are more naturalistic, the movements more human, the expressions warmer and more emotive. In the Western liturgy, Latin chants fill the air, solemn, structured, and steady. The prayers are clear and concise, shaped by the linguistic precision of Latin. The focus is on understanding as much as feeling, clarity as much as beauty. The worship has a sense of discipline and order, as if every word and movement has been carefully arranged to guide the faithful through the mysteries of the faith with calm and steady assurance. Neither world is better or more devout. They are simply reflections of different cultural hearts shaped by centuries of distinct experiences. In the Eastern world, art took on a symbolic nature. Icons became central, not as objects of worship, but as spiritual companions. An icon was theology in color and line. Its images were never meant to be realistic. Instead, they offered a vision of transfigured reality, where saints appear serene, elongated, illuminated by divine grace. The Eastern imagination saw icons as places where heaven touched earth, where the faithful could encounter holiness in a way that engaged the heart without overwhelming the senses. The West, with its love for narrative and tangible expression, created art that emphasized the humanity of Christ, the drama of biblical stories, and the emotional depth of devotion. Statues became important. Scenes of the crucifixion were rendered with moving realism. The West wanted believers to feel the pathos of Christ's suffering, the warmth of his compassion, the closeness of his human life. This was not a rejection of mystery, but a different way of entering into it. Through empathy, imagination, and the tangible touch of earthly beauty. Music followed a similar pattern. In the East, chant was elaborate, flowing, filled with long melodic lines that mirrored the undulating movements of prayer. The human voice soared gently, without instrumental accompaniment, forming a kind of living tapestry of sound. Chant was not meant to be watched or admired. It was meant to draw the soul upward, inviting worshippers into a contemplative stillness that fostered quiet communion with God. In the West, chant developed into what we now call Gregorian chant, steady, structured, and deeply peaceful. Its melodies were simple yet profound, designed to unify the voices of the community. Later, polyphony would develop in Western monasteries, adding layers of harmony. This musical evolution reflected the Western tendency toward order, symmetry, and intellectual clarity. It was a beauty built on harmony, restraint, and balance. Architecture also followed the contours of these cultural currents. The East embraced domes, symbols of heaven, rising like luminous shells above the sacred space. Hagia Sophia, with its floating dome and golden interior, became a masterpiece of this vision, expressing the Eastern longing to make the Church a reflection of the divine cosmos. Everything was designed to create an experience of transcendence. Light, color, and space worked together to remind the faithful that worship was entry into something eternal. In the West, basilicas evolved into Romanesque structures with rounded arches, thick walls, and heavy columns that conveyed stability and endurance. Later, the Gothic style emerged, lifting churches toward heaven with pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and stained glass windows that painted the interior with shifting colors. Western architecture expressed humanity's upward reach toward God, the yearning, the devotion, the hope. It was a vision of faith as ascent. Yet through all these differences, both East and West remained united in belief. Their creeds were the same. Their sacraments were the same. Their reverence for Scripture was the same. Their love for Christ, their devotion to the apostolic faith, and their commitment to prayer linked them in an unbroken bond that neither distance nor cultural drift could disrupt. Still, these differences mattered in subtle ways. As art, music, and liturgy shaped the imagination of believers, the two traditions began to form distinct spiritual sensibilities. The East grew accustomed to encountering God through mystery, contemplation, and symbolism. The West grew accustomed to encountering God through clarity, moral guidance, and personal devotion. These differences were gentle but real, like two siblings raised in the same home who, as adults, developed distinct personalities. Because these differences evolved gradually, no one at the time felt a sense of division. A Christian traveling from Rome to Constantinople might notice variations in worship but would still feel at home. Letters continued to flow between patriarchs. The Nicene Creed continued to unite them. The faith remained one, even as its expressions grew gently diverse. As you drift into deeper rest, imagine these two Christian worlds like two lanterns glowing beside one another. Their light is warm, steady, and enduring. Each lantern shines in a different hue, one more golden, one more blue, but both illuminate the same truth. Their differences do not diminish their shared devotion. They simply enrich the vast tapestry of Christian history with beauty and depth. In the next part of our series, we will explore how missionaries and the spread of Christianity across Europe and beyond continued to shape the emerging identities of East and West, further adding to the slow, peaceful divergence between the two traditions. Part 10. Missionaries and Frontiers: How Christianity Spread Differently East and West. As the night deepens and your breathing settles into a slow, comfortable rhythm, imagine the vast sweep of the Christian world in the centuries after the Great Councils. Though still united in faith, the Church was expanding into new lands, new languages, and new cultures. The story of how Christianity spread beyond its earliest centers reveals yet another gentle divergence between East and West, not born of rivalry, but shaped by geography, politics, and the quiet determination of missionaries who carried the gospel across mountains, forests, rivers, and seas. Picture the Christian world around the 6th and 7th centuries. To the east lies Constantinople, a glittering imperial capital surrounded by land steeped in Greek culture. Beyond it stretch the plains, mountains, and river valleys of Armenia, Georgia, and the Slavic world, lands where new peoples waited to hear the Christian message for the first time. To the west lies Rome, still noble though weathered, presiding spiritually over the fractured kingdoms of Western Europe. Beyond Rome stretch forests, coastlines, and islands where Christianity was just beginning to take root among the Germanic tribes, the Celts, and eventually the Norse. In both halves of the Christian world, missionaries played a crucial role in shaping how Christianity would unfold for centuries to come. But the styles, methods, and cultural expressions of these missionary efforts often differed in subtle ways, creating distinct patterns that would later contribute to the gradual divergence between East and West. To understand the Eastern mission, imagine a group of monks traveling quietly across the rugged terrain of Armenia or Georgia. Their robes are simple, their movements slow and purposeful. They carry few possessions, perhaps a gospel book, a wooden cross, and a small pouch of provisions. Their approach to mission work is contemplative. They seek to share the gospel not through force or political influence, but through gentle witness, wisdom, and humility. In the East, monasticism becomes the heart of missionary activity, offering a model of Christian life rooted in prayer, silence, and ascetic devotion. The Eastern missions often created a Christianity woven deeply into local culture. In Armenia, Christianity became intertwined with national identity, leading to the world's first officially Christian nation. In Georgia, the faith spread through the influence of holy women, monastics, and translators who devoted themselves to creating alphabets and scriptures in native languages. In the Slavic lands, Eastern missionaries like Saint Cyril and Methodius developed the Glagolitic alphabet, an early form of what would become Cyrillic, so that the Slavic people could worship in their own tongue. This reverence for local language and local culture became a hallmark of Eastern mission work, reflecting the belief that the gospel should take root without erasing the particular character of each people. Now imagine Western Europe in the same period. Rome, though diminished politically, becomes the center of missionary direction in the West. Its bishops send missionaries into lands ruled by kings, chiefs, and tribal leaders. Western missionaries often work through the conversion of rulers, believing that a Christian king would bring the faith to his people. This approach grows from the West's emphasis on order and pastoral care, seeing the Christianization of societies as a means of building stability and moral unity. Consider St. Patrick in Ireland. He traveled through valleys and hills, establishing monasteries, baptizing converts, and preaching the gospel with compassion. His mission blended Roman Christianity with Celtic traditions, creating a uniquely Irish expression of the faith, one characterized by poetry, scholarship, and monastic devotion. These Irish monasteries would later send missionaries into Scotland and northern England, spreading Christianity with gentleness and learning. Farther east, missionaries like St. Boniface traveled into the heart of Germanic Europe. They felled sacred trees, debated with tribal priests, and patiently founded monasteries that became centers of learning, agriculture, and culture. Western missionary work often focused on shaping societies from the ground up, establishing schools, copying manuscripts, cultivating farmland, and creating structured Christian communities. This approach reflected Rome's long-standing tradition of practical organization and moral discipline. As you drift gently into deeper rest, imagine the difference between these two missionary worlds. In the East, mission work radiates outward from monastic centers, emphasizing contemplation, mystical prayer, and integration with local culture. In the West, mission work radiates outward from Rome, emphasizing societal transformation, pastoral guidance, and unity under shared Latin liturgy. These differing patterns would later influence the spiritual temperaments of Orthodox Christianity in the East and Catholic Christianity in the West. Even the landscapes contributed to these differences. The rugged mountains of the Caucasus nurtured small, deeply rooted Christian communities that valued independence and monastic leadership. The forests and fields of Western Europe encouraged larger, organized dioceses, with bishops playing a prominent role in shaping the emerging Christian kingdoms. Despite these gentle divergences, the missionaries themselves never imagined a divided church. They saw themselves as servants of one faith, one baptism, one Lord. Their letters, prayers, and teachings testify to a shared Christian vision. A missionary from Rome traveling into Germany and a missionary from Constantinople traveling into Serbia would both recite the Nicene Creed with the same conviction. They would both read from the same scriptures. They would both honor the same Christ. Unity remained intact, even as expression varied. The translation of Scripture became another area where East and West experienced gentle drift. In the East, the Bible was translated into many languages: Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Slavonic, reflecting the Eastern Church's commitment to linguistic diversity. Each translation captured the beauty of Scripture in ways that resonated with local peoples, allowing new cultures to embrace Christianity while preserving their identities. In the West, Latin gradually became the unifying language of Scripture, liturgy, and learning. St. Jerome's Vulgate translation became authoritative, shaping Western theology for centuries. The Latin language created a sense of unity across the diverse kingdoms of Western Europe, but it also meant that local languages developed more slowly in liturgical contexts. Over time, Latin became a symbol of Western Christian identity, stable, universal, and deeply connected to Rome. Yet even here, the drift was gentle. Eastern Christians admired Latin scholarship. Western Christians admired Eastern theological depth. There was still much affection between the two worlds, still a sense that they belonged to the same spiritual family. As you lie peacefully, imagine these two worlds growing side by side, each sending out missionaries like lanterns flickering in the night. Their light spread across continents, illuminating new lands with the warmth of Christian faith. Though the lanterns shone in different hues, one shaped by Greek thought, one by Latin clarity, they lit the same path. In the next part of our series, we will quietly enter the heart of one of the most famous theological debates in Christian history, the Filioque, a small phrase in the Creed that became a symbolic marker of growing difference between East and West. Part 11. The Filioque is a calm exploration of the theology behind the debate. As the night settles softly around you and the world grows quiet, allow your mind to drift into one of the most delicate and often misunderstood topics in the long story of the Christian Church, the Filioque. Although later centuries would lift this small phrase into the center of heated theological debate, its early development was much more subtle, more gradual, and more rooted in pastoral concern than in any intent to divide. In this gentle chapter, we will explore how a single line in the Nicene Creed slowly became a symbol of difference between East and West. And we will do so the way this series always does, softly, patiently, and with deep respect for both traditions. To begin, recall the atmosphere of the early councils. The Nicene Creed, crafted first in 325 and expanded in 381, was a shared statement of faith recited across the entire Christian world. It proclaimed belief in the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, describing the Spirit as the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. This final phrase, who proceeds from the Father, expressed a theological understanding rooted deeply in Scripture and the teachings of the early Fathers. It was accepted and cherished by both the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. For centuries, nothing more was added to this part of the Creed. Christians recited the same words everywhere, from Rome to Jerusalem, from Constantinople to Alexandria. And then, quietly and almost invisibly, a small phrase began to appear in some Western regions, and the Son. In Latin, this phrase was one simple word, filioque. The filioque was not introduced with ceremony or controversy. It emerged gently in local liturgies in Spain sometime in the 6th century. At the time, the Western Church in the Iberian Peninsula faced a real pastoral challenge, a strong Arian movement that denied the full divinity of Christ. This heresy had persisted for generations among the Visigothic rulers and threatened the unity of Christian belief in the region. The filioque was added to emphasize the equality of the Father and the Son, showing that the Spirit was not inferior to Christ, nor Christ inferior to the Father. It was meant to strengthen the doctrine of the Trinity, not alter it. Imagine a Western congregation in Spain during this time. They gather for worship in a modest church built of local stone. Latin prayers drift through the air. The faithful kneel in reverent silence as the Creed is recited. When they say the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, their intention is to affirm the full divinity of Christ against the arguments of the Arians. They are not thinking of Constantinople, or theology in Greek, or anything beyond their own pastoral needs. They are simply trying to preserve truth as they understand it, in the face of misunderstanding and error. As decades passed, the filioque gradually found its way into other parts of the Western Church, especially in regions where Arianism remained strong. It spread quietly, not through decree from Rome, but through local adoption. Christianity in the West was deeply shaped by the desire for moral and doctrinal unity, and the filioque became integrated into that vision. Eventually, Rome itself adopted the filioque in its liturgy, though even Rome did so cautiously. For many centuries, popes hesitated to mandate it universally, aware that it was not part of the original creed agreed upon at the councils. But over time, the phrase became standard in the Latin West, so ingrained in worship that many Western Christians came to believe it had always been part of the creed. Meanwhile, the East continued to recite the original version without the filioque. To Eastern Christians, the phrase, "the Spirit proceeds from the Father," was not merely a statement of equality but a deep theological truth rooted in Trinitarian mystery. The Father was the single source of the Trinity, the fountainhead, the origin, the eternal beginning. Adding the filioque seemed to them to blur this role, to create confusion about the relationships between the divine persons, and to disrupt the delicate harmony that the early councils had so carefully articulated. Imagine an Eastern liturgy during this time. The faithful gather beneath the glowing dome of an Eastern church. Icon lamps flicker softly against golden walls. The choir chants the creed in Greek, "The Spirit proceeds from the Father." These words flow like poetry, rich with centuries of reflection. They evoke a sense of timeless mystery, of a divine order that should not be lightly altered. When Eastern Christians later heard that the West had added a phrase to this sacred prayer, many felt uneasy, not because they opposed Western devotion to Christ, but because they feared changes to the structure of Trinitarian theology that had been preserved with such care. It is important to remember that for centuries the filioque was not a source of open conflict. Communication between East and West was slow. Geography, language, and politics created long stretches of time where neither side closely monitored the other's liturgical developments. East and West were like two branches of a great tree growing in slightly different directions, but still sharing the same roots. When Eastern theologians eventually learned of the filioque's presence in Western liturgies, they raised concerns, not as accusations, but as earnest questions. They wondered whether the addition had been made with sufficient theological reflection. They worried about preserving the unity of the creed, which had been agreed upon in ecumenical councils. They feared that changes to the creed, even made with good intentions, could set a precedent that weakened the authority of the councils. Western theologians responded with sincerity, explaining that the filioque was not meant to change doctrine but to clarify it against heresy. They argued that Eastern and Western expressions were fully compatible when properly understood. In Latin theology, proceeding had a slightly broader meaning than in Greek, making the filioque more acceptable within the linguistic framework of the West. Eastern theologians acknowledged this nuance but felt that such distinctions needed careful conciliar discussion, not quiet regional adoption. As you drift deeper toward sleep, imagine these conversations not as arguments but as thoughtful exchanges between two beloved siblings trying to understand one another across a long distance. The differences were real, but the affection remained. There was no rupture, no anger, no sense that the church was dividing. Just sincere Christians speaking from different intellectual worlds, shaped by different histories and different languages. Yet as with many gentle divergences in the past, the filioque eventually became a symbol of deeper differences. The West saw itself as guarding unity through clarity. The East saw itself as guarding mystery through fidelity to the original text. Neither intention was hostile. Both were born from love of God and devotion to truth. What made the Filioque difficult was not the phrase itself, but what its journey revealed about East and West. Their different approaches to authority, tradition, language, and theology. The West believed that the Church had the authority to clarify doctrine when needed. The East believed that only an ecumenical council could alter something as central as the Creed. The West emphasized unity under a single shepherd. The East emphasized unity through conciliar harmony. These differing instincts would later surface in more significant disagreements, but in these early centuries, they remained soft shadows on the horizon. As you rest, imagine the Filioque not as a spark of division, but as a small stone placed gently on a path that would one day diverge more dramatically, but only after centuries of peace. In the next part of our series, we will explore how political tensions, miscommunication, and cultural distance slowly began to stretch the bond between East and West during the centuries leading up to 1054. Part 12. Tensions rise, miscommunication, politics, and distance. As you settle more deeply into calm and quiet, let your thoughts drift into a period of Christian history where the unity between East and West, so carefully preserved over centuries, began to feel the subtle pull of strain. This was not yet the Great Schism, not the formal rupture that would come later, but rather a long, slow unfolding of circumstances, misunderstandings, and political pressures that gradually stretched the bonds of communion thinner and thinner. Much like the gentle shifting of continents, the movement was slow, almost imperceptible, and often unintended. Yet it was real, and it marked the beginning of a turning point in the relationship between the Latin West and the Greek East. To understand this period, imagine two friends who have known one another since childhood. They share memories, values, and a common heritage. But as they grow older, life leads them down different paths. One settles in a bustling, politically complex city, the other remains in a quieter, more contemplative region. Over the years, their letters grow less frequent. Misunderstandings arise not from malice, but from distance. Their differing environments shape their outlooks. Each still cares for the other deeply, yet their lives now feel increasingly separate. This quiet drift is the best way to envision the relationship between Rome and Constantinople during the centuries leading up to the 11th century. Several forces contributed to this gradual tension, and they unfolded gently over time. One of the earliest and most persistent challenges was political. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the East and West no longer lived under the same political umbrella. Constantinople remained a thriving imperial capital, with emperors who saw themselves as guardians of the Christian world. Rome, on the other hand, existed within a patchwork of emerging Western kingdoms, Gothic, Lombard, Frankish, often unstable, often at odds with one another. The Pope in Rome and the Emperor in Constantinople lived in worlds shaped by different concerns. The Emperor dealt with military threats on multiple fronts, Persians in the east, Slavs and Avars in the Balkans, and later the rise of Islam sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. The Pope dealt with regional kings, disputes over land, and the constant need to protect the Church's independence. These differing realities created differing expectations for how Church and state should interact. As you breathe softly, picture Rome in the 8th century, surrounded by political uncertainty. The Lombards threaten the city. The Byzantine emperor, far away in Constantinople, seems unable or unwilling to send military aid. In this environment, the Pope turns to a new protector, the Frankish King Pepin, and later his son, Charlemagne. This alliance becomes a turning point. The Pope crowns Charlemagne as the Emperor of the Romans in the year 800, a moment that shocks Constantinople. For the Byzantines, the imperial title was not simply a political label. It represented divine order, continuity, and legitimacy. There could not be two emperors of the same empire. Yet now there was Charlemagne in the west and an emperor in the east, each claiming a role that once belonged to one office. This political rupture was not born from hostility but from necessity. Rome needed protection. Charlemagne needed legitimacy. Yet to the east, it felt like the West was ignoring centuries of imperial tradition. The two worlds were beginning to speak different political languages, even as they still professed the same faith. Miscommunication was another quiet force widening the gap. With the Mediterranean world fractured by wars, trade disruptions, and linguistic barriers, letters between Rome and Constantinople sometimes took months to arrive. When they did, they could be misunderstood. Latin and Greek do not map perfectly onto each other. Nuances were lost. Phrases meant gently in one tongue sounded harsh in another. Theological discussions, already complex, became vulnerable to misinterpretation. Imagine receiving a letter from a distant friend written in a language you understand only partly. You try your best to interpret the tone, but you are not sure if the writer is correcting you, criticizing you, or simply describing something. Now multiply this by centuries, by political tensions, by cultural differences. This is how many early disagreements between East and West felt, not like conflicts, but like conversations carried out across a widening ocean. Even liturgical customs contributed to rising tensions. In the East, leavened bread was used in the Eucharist, symbolizing the risen Christ. In the West, unleavened bread was used, symbolizing the bread used by Jesus at the Last Supper. These differences had existed peacefully for centuries, but over time, as identity grew more regional, small variations acquired greater symbolic weight. Similarly, clerical celibacy gradually became the norm in the West but remained optional in the East. Fasting customs differed. Church administration differed. Even the dates of certain feasts sometimes differed. None of these variations were doctrinal disputes. They were simply expressions of local tradition. Yet as the distance between East and West grew, each tradition sometimes felt puzzled by the other's practices. The filioque, which we explored in the previous part, added another layer of complexity, not because of the phrase itself, but because of how it was handled. The West saw the addition as a pastoral clarification. The East felt it needed an ecumenical council. The disagreement was not fundamentally theological, it was procedural. It revealed differing instincts about how the universal church should function. Over time, these small disagreements accumulated like pebbles placed one by one on a scale. Alone, each pebble was light. Together, they gradually created a sense of imbalance. Personality also played a role. Certain patriarchs of Constantinople were more diplomatic, others were more assertive. Certain popes emphasized unity, others emphasized authority. Some emperors supported Rome, others resented it. These shifting personalities sometimes caused friction that later generations interpreted as broader theological disputes, when in truth they were often interpersonal or political. As you drift further into tranquility, picture the Christian world of the 10th century. Rome and Constantinople still shared the creed, the sacraments, and the apostolic faith. But they now stood like two great cities on opposite shores of a wide sea. They could still see each other. They could still send envoys across the waters. But their worlds had grown distinct. Their languages, customs, politics, and assumptions no longer aligned as naturally as they once had. And yet, in this period, no one expected a permanent division. The idea would have pained both East and West. Each still believed deeply in the unity of the Church. Differences were seen as challenges to overcome, not reasons for separation. Unity remained a cherished goal. The tensions of this era were not storms. They were gentle tides rising slowly, almost unnoticed. But tides, if they rise long enough, can reshape the shoreline. In the next part of our series, we will arrive at the year 1054, the moment often called the Great Schism, not as an explosive event, but as a quiet culmination of centuries of drift. Part 13. The year 1054, a gentle unfolding of misunderstood moments. As the night grows deeper and your breathing slows into a peaceful rhythm, allow your thoughts to drift toward one of the most frequently mentioned dates in Christian history, the year 1054. It is often spoken of as the moment when the Great Schism happened, as though a single dramatic event shattered centuries of unity in an instant. But in truth, the reality was much quieter, much more human, and far more subtle than that. What happened in 1054 was not an explosion, but rather a gentle, confused unraveling of relationships that had been gradually loosening for hundreds of years. Let us slip slowly into that moment and explore what really occurred, in a way that is soft, patient, and easy to follow as you rest. To begin, imagine Constantinople in the mid-11th century. It is still one of the most magnificent cities in the world. Its golden mosaics shimmer under lamplight, its libraries overflow with centuries of Greek scholarship, and its streets hum with merchants, sailors, monks, and scholars. The great Hagia Sophia rises like a mountain of stone and light, its dome catching the faint glow of dawn or dusk depending on the hour. Into this world arrives a delegation from the West. Pope Leo IX, troubled by growing tensions and accusations between East and West, sends a group of envoys to Constantinople. Their purpose is not to divide the Church. Quite the opposite. They are sent to repair relations, to address theological concerns, and to strengthen unity. But the delegation carries with it a tone shaped by Western assumptions about authority, procedure, and the role of the papacy that do not align naturally with the worldview of the East. At the heart of this delicate moment is Cardinal Humbert, a man of deep conviction and strong personality. While respected in the West for his learning and loyalty, he is also known for being firm, sometimes overly firm, in expressing his positions. His temperament does not blend easily with the more diplomatic, nuanced styles of the Eastern court. On the eastern side stands Patriarch Michael Cerularius, the spiritual leader of Constantinople. He too is a strong personality, committed to protecting the traditions and dignity of the Eastern Church. His concerns are partly theological, partly cultural, and partly political. He feels that Constantinople, as the most prominent city of the East, should not be overshadowed by Roman claims of authority. Neither man intends harm. Neither seeks schism. Both believe they are defending the integrity of the Church. But their convictions, combined with misunderstandings and the enormous distance, spiritually and culturally, between East and West, create a fragile environment. Now imagine the first meetings between Humbert and Cerularius. There is formality, politeness, and a sense of ceremony. But underneath these gestures lies tension. Language barriers create misunderstandings. Latin phrases do not map neatly onto Greek concepts. Each side believes it is speaking clearly, but what is heard is not always what was intended. Every conversation is shaped by centuries of differing habits, differing customs, differing assumptions about how authority should be exercised. In this fragile atmosphere, miscommunication grows. One of the most delicate issues raised is the filioque. The Eastern Patriarch requests that the Western envoys explain why the West added the phrase to the creed without the approval of an ecumenical council. The Western envoys respond with confidence, believing that the Pope has the authority to clarify doctrine when needed. Their explanations, intended to be reassuring, come across to the Eastern side as dismissive of long-standing conciliar tradition. Another issue lies in liturgical customs. Cerularius objects to Western fasting practices and the use of unleavened bread, viewing them as deviations from ancient norms. The Western envoys, meanwhile, consider these customs legitimate and even ancient in the West. Neither side doubts the other's sincerity, but each believes the other is making unnecessary criticisms. As you rest, picture these exchanges not as heated arguments, but as tense conversations between people who share the same faith but have grown accustomed to different worlds. The atmosphere grows heavier. Letters are delivered, each more formal than the last. Tone becomes an issue. The Western envoys believe they are speaking from the authority of the Pope. The Eastern Patriarch believes he is defending the integrity of the universal Church. Neither sees himself as doing anything wrong. Then comes the moment that history remembers. On July 16, 1054, Cardinal Humbert, frustrated by the lack of progress, enters the Hagia Sophia during the Divine Liturgy and places a bull of excommunication on the altar. It is a dramatic gesture, but it is important to understand its context gently and clearly. Humbert believes, wrongly, that he is carrying out the Pope's wishes. But Pope Leo IX has died months earlier. According to canon law, Humbert's authority as an envoy technically ended with the Pope's death. This means the bull of excommunication has no legal force. Yet symbolism matters, and the gesture has weight. The bull accuses Cerularius of various errors, some real, some exaggerated, some misunderstood. The language is harsh, shaped by Western rhetorical style. To the Eastern clergy witnessing this moment, it feels like an attack, not a plea for reconciliation. Cerularius responds as any leader would, given the situation. He calls a synod and issues a counter-excommunication, not against all Western Christians, but specifically against the envoys who issued the bull. His intention is defensive, not divisive. He is protecting his church's dignity. And just like that, through a series of misunderstandings, procedural mistakes, strong personalities, and wounded pride, the symbolic break occurs. But here is what matters most for you to know, especially as you drift deeper into peaceful thought. In 1054, neither side believed the Church had split. Neither side intended a permanent rupture. Neither side imagined that future centuries would look back on this moment as the Great Schism. The people of that time saw these events as a severe quarrel, yes, but one that could be resolved. Even after the excommunications, East and West continued to share the same creed, the same sacraments, and the same faith. Communion between individual communities continued. Diplomatic efforts resumed in later decades. There was still hope for unity. The true separation would not solidify until much later, shaped by wars, crusades, politics, and growing cultural estrangement. In this soft light, the events of 1054 look less like a violent break and more like a heartbreak, quiet, gradual, painful, and full of misunderstanding. As your mind drifts gently, imagine the scene fading like candlelight at the end of a long day. The envoys return to the West. the Patriarch continues his work in the East. Life continues. The Church still breathes with two lungs, even if they are no longer moving in perfect harmony. In the next part, we will move into the centuries after 1054, when the widening gap was deepened by political turmoil and the dramatic events of the Crusades. Part 14. The Crusades and the quiet deepening of distance. As you settle deeper into your pillow and feel the tension in your body soften, let your thoughts drift into the next centuries, where the Christian world found itself swept into movements far larger and more turbulent than any theologian or patriarch could have imagined. These centuries would come to be defined by the Crusades, a series of military campaigns that reshaped the relationship between East and West in ways that were both profound and unintended. Tonight, we will explore those events not through the lens of conflict, but through the gentle, reflective understanding that time and distance allow. To begin, imagine the world at the end of the 11th century. The Christian East is under pressure. The Byzantine Empire, once mighty and expansive, now struggles against external threats. Its borders have shrunk. The once glorious provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt have long been part of the Islamic world, and the Seljuk Turks press deeper into Anatolia, threatening lands that have been Byzantine for centuries. In Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos seeks allies to strengthen his defenses. In the West, meanwhile, the spiritual atmosphere is alive with new movements of piety, reform, and devotion. The idea of pilgrimage has grown in popularity. People yearn for deeper connection with the holy sites of Christianity. The papacy, asserting new authority and moral leadership, searches for ways to unite Western Christians under a sacred cause. Into this atmosphere, at the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II makes his famous call for aid. Western Christians should journey eastward, he says, to help their fellow Christians and to reclaim the holy places. From a certain point of view, it is a compassionate appeal, a moment of East and West reaching toward one another. Urban II's message is shaped by genuine concern for the Byzantine Empire, by the desire to protect pilgrims, and by the dream of restoring Christian unity. At that moment, no one in the West imagines that crusading will later contribute to division. The mood is hopeful, energized, even idealistic. But as armies begin to gather, as shields are polished and banners unfurled, differences quietly begin to surface. The first crusading armies do not resemble the carefully trained troops the Byzantines expect. Instead, they include large numbers of peasants, zealously enthusiastic but militarily inexperienced. These groups travel across Byzantine lands with little discipline, causing unease among the local population. Language barriers make communication difficult. Byzantine officials, accustomed to strict hierarchy and imperial order, view the Crusaders as unpredictable guests. Western Crusaders, unused to the complex etiquette and diplomacy of Byzantium, sometimes interpret caution as coldness or suspicion. These misunderstandings are not malicious. They are the natural friction of two worlds that have lived apart for centuries. As the First Crusade progresses, relations improve. Byzantine ships ferry Crusaders across the Bosporus. The Crusaders reclaim Nicaea, Ansh, and eventually Jerusalem. But even here, cooperation is complicated. Some Crusader leaders fail to honor their promises to return captured cities to Byzantine control. The Byzantines, who had hoped for the restoration of their empire, watch with concern as Western Crusader states establish their own independent footholds in the East. This divergence of goals, Byzantine restoration versus Western conquest, creates a quiet tension that lingers beneath the surface. As you breathe calmly, Picture the Eastern and Western Christians in these early crusading years. They pray to the same Christ, recite the same creed, share the same sacraments, yet increasingly see the world through different political and cultural lenses. Their suspicions grow not from theology, but from the practical realities of war, diplomacy, and survival. The Second and Third Crusades deepen misunderstandings. Western leaders, frustrated by military failures, sometimes blame the Byzantines for not providing enough support. Byzantines, wary of Western ambitions, sometimes negotiate with Muslim rulers to protect their own lands. Each side sees its actions as necessary, each misreads the other's intent. Yet even in these moments of tension, unity is not forgotten. The churches remain officially connected. The Schism of 1054 is not felt as a settled reality but as a wound that might heal. The true shift comes with the Fourth Crusade. This is one of the most tragic and difficult episodes in the entire history of East and West, but in our sleep-friendly tone, we will approach it gently, with the soft perspective of centuries later. The Fourth Crusade begins with noble intentions, another journey to the Holy Land. But through a series of political entanglements, financial pressures, and shifting alliances, the Crusader army is diverted. Instead of traveling to Egypt or Jerusalem, it sails toward Constantinople. Imagine Constantinople in 1204. Its domes shine, its streets are filled with scholars, merchants, monks, and families who have lived there for generations. It is one of the greatest Christian cities in the world, a place where ancient hymns drift through candlelit churches and scholars debate theology beneath mosaics of shimmering gold. And then, in a moment that would echo through centuries, Crusader armies breach the city's defenses. The sack of Constantinople is devastating. Churches are looted. Icons are torn from walls. Libraries are destroyed. Sacred relics are carried off to the west. Even the Hagia Sophia is desecrated. It is a wound so deep that the memory of it continues to shape Eastern Christian identity to this day. The Byzantines do eventually reclaim their city in 1261, but the empire is never the same. Its wealth, stability, and confidence have been irreparably shaken. For the East, the Fourth Crusade is not merely a military disaster, it is a spiritual heartbreak. It becomes a symbol of Western misunderstanding, of Western aggression, even if the Crusaders themselves never intended to attack fellow Christians when they first set out. For the West, the event is later seen with sorrow, regret, and often confusion. Many Western Christians, clergy and lay alike, believed that the Crusade had lost its way long before reaching Constantinople. This moment represents the deepest point of separation between East and West up to that time. Even though both remained Christian, the emotional and cultural gulf between them grew wider than ever before. Yet even here, as harsh as the events seem when told plainly, there is a softer truth worth remembering. Neither the sack of Constantinople nor the earlier Crusades were motivated by a desire to divide the Church. They were the product of political pressures, economic strains, miscommunication, and the unpredictable chaos of medieval warfare. The wounds they caused were real, but the intentions behind them were far more complex and often far more innocent than later histories portray. As your mind drifts, imagine the two great Christian traditions as two vast cathedrals standing side by side in the night. One is built of marble and gold, echoing with ancient chants in Greek. The other is built of stone and wood, filled with Latin hymns and warm candlelight. They both reach toward heaven. They both shelter the faithful. But the roads between them have grown tangled and overgrown, not because of malice, but because of centuries of storms that neither tradition fully controlled. In the next part of our journey, we will explore how the centuries after the Fourth Crusade continued to reshape the relationship between East and West, sometimes drawing them closer, sometimes pushing them further apart, until the schism became not a moment, but a long and gentle settling into two distinct identities. Part 15. Aftershocks and quiet distance, the long years of slow separation. As you relax deeper into your breath and let the softness of the moment surround you, imagine the centuries after the Fourth Crusade unfolding like the slow settling of dust after a great storm. Nothing shatters all at once. Instead, the particles drift downward in a quiet snowfall, drifting into corners and cracks, reshaping the landscape almost imperceptibly. This is how the separation between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches continued to unfold after the traumatic events of 1204. Despite the depth of the wound, the story that follows is not one of constant hostility, but one of long stretches of silence, brief attempts at reconciliation, political entanglements, and gradual evolution into distinct identities. When the Byzantines regained control of Constantinople in 1261, the city was a shadow of its former brilliance. The mosaics still sparkled, the dome still glowed in the evening light, and the hymns of the divine liturgy still resonated with ancient beauty. But the city's wealth had been stripped, its defenses weakened, and its sense of security disturbed beyond repair. Many citizens who had survived the sack carried memories of those days like scars on their hearts. They had seen Christian knights break down the gates of their sacred city. They had watched relics, icons, and treasures carried away. They had lost trust in the intentions of the Latin West. Yet at the same time, these same Byzantines also knew that not all Western Christians approved of what had happened. They knew that monks, bishops, and scholars across Europe mourned the tragedy sincerely. They knew that the Crusaders who plundered the city did not represent the entire Western Church. This duality, grief mixed with understanding, created a complicated emotional landscape in which any hope of reconciliation would be fragile and uncertain. The centuries that followed were filled with such complexities. Political needs often forced East and West into temporary alliances. Sometimes emperors sought help from the West against Turkish invasions. Sometimes popes sent envoys seeking unity. At other times, tensions resurfaced through disputes over jurisdiction, diplomacy, or the movement of armies across contested territories. To understand this period, it helps to imagine the East and West as two neighboring households who once shared a single home. They now live in separate houses with separate routines. They speak different languages and follow different customs. But on some days, one might knock on the other's door in times of trouble. On other days, misunderstandings or old grievances might cause tension. They are not enemies, but they are no longer as close as they once were. One of the most significant attempts at reconciliation occurred at the Council of Lyons in 1274, less than 2 decades after the restoration of Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos needed military support from the West to strengthen his fragile hold on the empire. To secure this help, he agreed to accept the filioque, papal primacy, and other Western positions. For a brief moment, at least on paper, communion was restored. But this union existed largely in political documents and diplomatic correspondence. It never reached the hearts of the Eastern clergy or the faithful. The people of Constantinople, still carrying the trauma of 1204, viewed the union as a betrayal. Monks protested it. Bishops refused to endorse it. Even Michael VIII's own family rejected the compromise. When he died, the union disappeared almost instantly, swept away like dust by a sudden gust of wind. A similar attempt happened in the 15th century at the Council of Florence. By this time, the Byzantine Empire had shrunk drastically, reduced to little more than Constantinople and a few surrounding territories. The Ottoman Empire pressed closer each year, tightening the noose around the ancient city. In desperation, the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Palaiologos traveled with a delegation of bishops to Italy, pleading for Western military assistance. The council that followed was long, complex, and deeply emotional. The Eastern bishops debated the filioque, papal primacy, purgatory, and other matters with their Western counterparts. Theologians translated arguments from Greek to Latin and back again. The meetings lasted months, then years. Eventually, exhausted and aware of their desperate political situation, most Eastern representatives signed a decree of union. But once again, the union lived on paper more than in practice. When the bishops returned home, the people rejected the agreement. The clergy refused to implement it. Monks denounced it. The spiritual instincts of the East, shaped by centuries of conciliar tradition and deep theological reflection, could not accept that unity should be achieved through political necessity. For many, the differences were not merely academic, they were part of who they were, part of their spiritual identity. And so, the union dissolved quietly. Only a few years later, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. The city that had once stood as the beating heart of the Christian East, the city of golden mosaics and imperial processions, was now part of a new empire. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of Byzantium, but it did not mark the end of Eastern Orthodoxy. In fact, the Orthodox Church found ways to survive, adapt, and even thrive under Ottoman rule. It developed new forms of leadership, new patterns of worship, and new ways of preserving its identity. But it also grew further from the West, physically and politically isolated behind new borders. During these centuries, the divide between East and West no longer felt like an open wound, it felt like a settled reality, something woven into the daily rhythms of Christian life. The two traditions still shared much. The sacraments, the scriptures, the early councils, and the profound reverence for Christ. But their languages, cultures, and historical trajectories had diverged too deeply for an easy return to unity. The West continued to develop under the growing influence of scholastic theology, the rise of universities, and later the dramatic changes brought about by the Protestant Reformation. The East continued to cultivate its own theological approach, deeply rooted in mystical prayer, monastic life, and the spiritual vision of the Church Fathers. These paths, though distinct, were not hostile. They were simply different. As you rest, imagine these two great traditions like two rivers flowing from the same mountain. In the beginning, they run side by side, fed by the same spring. As they travel through valleys and forests, they drift apart, shaped by the terrain of history. By the time they reach the wide plain centuries later, they are flowing in different channels, carrying with them the colors, sediments, and stories of their unique journeys. Part 15, then, is not about conflict but about acceptance, about how, over centuries, the Christian East and West slowly settled into separate identities with a sense of inevitability. The schism was not an act. It was not a moment of decision. It was a long settling of differences that neither side fully intended, shaped by history more than by doctrine. In the next part of our series, we will explore how these identities developed, what became distinct about Roman Catholicism, what became distinct about Eastern Orthodoxy, and how each tradition blossomed in its own way after the separation. Part 16. Two traditions, two paths, how Catholicism and Orthodoxy grew into their own identities. As the room around you grows softer and quieter, let your mind float calmly into the centuries that followed the settling of the East and West divide. By this time, the dust of political upheaval had settled, the echoes of Crusader armies had faded, and the two great branches of Christianity, Roman Catholicism in the West and Eastern Orthodoxy in the East, began to grow into their own distinct shapes. Their differences were not born from anger, but from centuries of living in different worlds, breathing different air, speaking different languages, and responding to different cultural rhythms. Imagine the Christian world after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. On one side stands the Latin West, a world of universities, monasteries, kingdoms, and cathedrals stretching from Ireland to Italy, from France to the rising kingdoms of Spain and Portugal. On the other side stands the Greek East, a world of monasteries perched on mountaintops, ancient hymns echoing through candlelit chapels, and communities living under Ottoman rule yet preserving the faith handed down through generations. Though separated, both traditions carried the same gospel, both honored the same saints of the early church, and both cherished the memory of the councils where their ancestors once debated theology together. Their paths diverged gently, shaped by circumstance as much as by conviction. Begin with the West. Picture a medieval university, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, where scholars gather in grand lecture halls filled with parchment manuscripts, ink pots, and wooden benches polished by years of study. In these centers of learning, Western theology takes on an increasingly systematic form. Scholars such as Thomas Aquinas, Anselm of Canterbury, and Bonaventure write treatises that weave together scripture, philosophy, and logical reasoning. Their aim is clarity, organization, and intellectual precision. They build theology like a cathedral of ideas, each stone carefully placed, each arch supported by reason and argument. This scholastic approach becomes one of the defining features of Western Christianity. It is not cold or mechanical; at its best, it is filled with awe and devotion, but it is structured, analytical, and deeply engaged with classical philosophy, especially that of Aristotle. Over time, the West develops an intellectual culture that values definitions, categories, councils, and codified canon law. The papacy grows more centralized, becoming not only a spiritual symbol but also an administrative and diplomatic authority that oversees vast territories across Europe. As you breathe gently, imagine the contrast in the East. Eastern Christianity, shaped by centuries of monastic tradition, takes a different approach. Rather than building a cathedral of ideas, Eastern theologians cultivate a garden of prayer. Their writings are filled with mystical contemplation, poetic imagery, and deep silence. They draw upon the early fathers, Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, Athanasius, John Chrysostom, and keep their teachings alive through liturgy, iconography, and monastic life. Theology in the East is not something to be conquered through argument but something to be breathed, experienced, and lived through the rhythms of prayer. In this world, the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, becomes a heartbeat of spiritual life. Icons serve as windows into divine mysteries, not merely decorations. The liturgy becomes a cosmic drama, connecting heaven and earth in a dance of incense, chant, and sacred poetry. The Eastern Church treasures mystery, emphasizing that God's essence is unknowable, reachable only through divine grace. The goal of life is theosis, union with God, not through intellectual mastery but through transformation of the heart. Both traditions are beautiful, but each is shaped by its environment. The West, navigating the politics of kingdoms, the growth of cities, and the founding of universities, develops a church accustomed to structure, order, and institutional unity. The East, surviving under foreign rulers, cultivating monastic resilience and preserving ancient traditions, develops a faith centered on mystical continuity, contemplative depth, and communal worship. Neither trajectory is right or wrong, they are simply different ways of living out the same faith. As centuries pass, these differences become more pronounced. The West experiences the Renaissance, with its flourishing of art, humanism, and exploration. Gothic cathedrals rise toward the sky, their stained glass windows glowing like gems in sunlight. Missionary movements spread Catholicism across the oceans, to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The papacy becomes not just the guardian of Europe's Christianity, but a global spiritual authority. The East encounters different challenges. Under Ottoman rule, the Orthodox Church must navigate the complexities of religious minority status. Patriarchs become both spiritual leaders and representatives of their communities in the eyes of the state. Monasteries become crucial centers of learning, preserving manuscripts and spiritual traditions. When the Russian state grows in power, Moscow begins to see itself as the Third Rome, a protector of orthodoxy after the fall of Constantinople. The Russian Orthodox tradition flourishes, producing new saints, new hymns, and new forms of spiritual expression, even as the Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Romanian churches maintain their own vibrant traditions. Throughout all of this, the core differences between East and West settle into place, not as hostile opposites, but as two distinct spiritual lifestyles. In the West, the Church emphasizes the authority of the Pope, systematic theology, scholastic reasoning, canon law, missionary expansion, the sacraments as channels of grace, a more centralized structure. In the East, the Church emphasizes conciliar decision-making, mystical theology, monastic life as a spiritual ideal, icons as expressions of doctrine, the liturgy as the heart of Christian life, the ancient languages of worship, decentralized, autocephalous leadership. These distinctions do not erase the shared foundation. Both traditions still honor the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Resurrection, the sacraments, and the heritage of the early Church. Both celebrate Easter as the center of the Christian year. Both cherish Scripture. Both see the Church as the body of Christ. The differences are in emphasis, not in the fundamental heart of the faith. As your breathing deepens, imagine these two traditions like two great ancient trees standing side by side in a quiet forest. They share the same soil. Scripture, apostolic tradition, the early councils. Their trunks rise from the same roots. But as they reach upward, their branches spread in different directions. One grows toward the morning sun with wide-reaching leaves, catching the first light of day. The other grows toward the evening sky, its branches filling with shadows and cool blue hues. Both are beautiful. Both are strong. Both provide shelter to countless believers across generations. By the late Middle Ages, the separation between East and West is no longer a question of debate, it has become a lived reality. Catholics and Orthodox Christians pray differently, celebrate liturgy differently, teach theology differently, and organize their communities differently. The separation is not full of anger, it is simply the way history has unfolded. In the next part of our series, we will explore the late medieval and early modern periods, where further historical forces, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of nation-states, create even greater distance between the two traditions. Part 17. Renaissance, Reformation, and the quiet widening of the divide. As you settle into the softness of your bed, let your mind drift once more into the quiet, unfolding world of history. The centuries after the initial separation of East and West were not marked by dramatic confrontations or loud declarations. Instead, they were shaped by deep cultural movements, slow changes in society, and quiet transformations that gradually made the two great traditions feel even more distant from one another. In this part of our peaceful journey, we turn to the late Middle Ages and early modern period. This is a time of remarkable change. The Renaissance breathing new life into art and scholarship, the Protestant Reformation reshaping the Western Church, and new political landscapes emerging across Europe and beyond. Though the Eastern and Western churches no longer shared full communion, their paths continued to reflect and influence the shifting world around them in subtle ways. To begin, imagine Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the West, new ideas are stirring. Artists like Giotto and later Michelangelo begin to see the world with fresh eyes, depicting the human body with empathy, realism, and beauty. Scholars rediscover ancient Greek texts, not through Byzantium but through Latin translations and new academic interest. Humanist thinkers begin to focus more on classical learning, rhetoric, and the dignity of the human person. This intellectual and cultural flowering, later known as the Renaissance, transforms Western Europe's imagination. Strikingly, many of the intellectual treasures that fuel the Renaissance came from the East: Greek manuscripts, preserved for centuries in Byzantine libraries, copied lovingly by monks, and brought into Europe by scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453. In a gentle, almost poetic way, the East indirectly nourishes the West even while separated from it ecclesiastically. Yet the Renaissance also deepens the differences between the two traditions. In the West, art becomes more naturalistic, influenced by classical sculpture and geometry. Theology becomes increasingly systematic and philosophical. Churches fill with stained glass, frescoes, painted altarpieces, and sculpted marble. In the East, iconography remains rooted in ancient tradition, stylized, symbolic, stillness-filled, designed as windows into the divine rather than realistic portrayals of earthly life. The Eastern world continues to cultivate a mystical, contemplative style of devotion, largely untouched by Renaissance humanism. These differences do not cause conflict, they simply deepen the distinct identities of each tradition. But the next great event in the West, the Protestant Reformation, widens the gap further. Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the early 1500s. Printing presses hum with new energy. Ideas spread faster, carried on sheets of paper inked with bold claims and new interpretations. Martin Luther, a German monk seeking reform within the Church, challenges certain Western practices and doctrines. His words ignite a movement that spreads from Germany to Switzerland, England, Scandinavia, and beyond. Suddenly, the Western Christian world is fractured, not into two parts, but into many. Catholics and Protestants now debate theology, liturgy, and authority with passionate intensity. Kingdoms choose sides. Wars erupt. Entire regions shift religious allegiance. For the Eastern Orthodox, watching from afar, the Reformation seems both familiar and foreign. Familiar because they recognize some concerns, such as the need for renewal, deeper spiritual life, and pastoral care. Foreign because the Protestant critiques are aimed at uniquely Western developments, papal centralization, scholastic theology, indulgences, and Latin liturgy. The East is not directly involved, yet the Reformation reshapes how the West understands itself, how it organizes its faith, and how it views tradition. While Catholics respond to the Reformation through the Council of Trent, solidifying doctrines and reaffirming papal authority, the Orthodox continue their own quiet spiritual path, guided by monastic wisdom and the liturgy that had long shaped their identity. They observe the Western upheaval from a distance, neither joining nor opposing it directly, but recognizing that the world of Western Christianity has now become even more different from their own. For the first time in history, the Catholic and Orthodox churches now relate not only to one another but also to an entirely new religious landscape in the West. The gap is not created by hostility, but by difference, by historical forces that shape each tradition's identity in unique ways. As your breathing grows deeper, imagine another layer of change unfolding during these centuries, the rise of the nation-state. In the West, kingdoms centralize power. France grows stronger. Spain unites under Ferdinand and Isabella. England navigates internal struggles that eventually solidify into a powerful monarchy. These nations often align themselves with the Catholic or Protestant cause, weaving religion into emerging national identities. In the East, the experience differs. After the fall of Constantinople, much of the Orthodox world lives under Ottoman rule, where churches must navigate a delicate balance between autonomy and submission to the empire. Meanwhile, Russia rises as a major Orthodox power, eventually forming the Russian Empire under the Tsars. Moscow becomes an influential spiritual center, home to monasteries, iconographers, and theologians. The Russian Church develops distinct customs while still remaining connected to the broader Orthodox tradition. In this new world, East and West drift even further apart, not because of hostility but because their surroundings shape them in different ways. Western Europe moves through Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment. Eastern Europe lives through Ottoman administration, Slavic cultural development, and later the expansion of Russia. The languages of worship. Latin in the West, later vernacular languages for Protestants, and Greek, Slavonic, Arabic, and other tongues in the East further separate their experiences. Theologies continue to develop differently. Music, art, and prayer take on unique forms. Slowly, gently, almost inevitably, the two traditions settle into distinct worlds. And yet, there are still moments of connection. Ambassadors travel. Scholars write letters. Some leaders dream of reconciliation. The Council of Florence may have failed politically, but it shows that both sides were still longing for unity in some form. Even during the Reformation, some Protestant scholars study Greek theology and admire Eastern spiritual writings. Catholic missionaries encounter Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe and sometimes exchange mutual respect, even amid doctrinal disagreement. Throughout these centuries, the separation becomes not an open wound but a quiet fact. Something noted, something discussed, but not something fought about. The schism has matured into two separate paths that continue to win forward, still parallel in many ways, still rooted in the same first-century church, but distinct nonetheless. As night gathers softly around you, imagine once more the two great trees of Christianity. Their trunks grow further apart as the centuries pass. Their branches sway in different winds. One tree stretches its roots into the soil of Renaissance curiosity, Reformation debate, and global missionary movement. The other sinks its roots into the deep earth of monastic mysticism, liturgical poetry, and ancient continuity. Their leaves rustle with different theological accents. But both trees stand tall, both honoring the same sun, both drawing life from the same source. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the modern era. How the rise of global travel, scholarship, diplomacy, An ecumenical dialogue brought Catholic and Orthodox Christians into renewed contact, not as rivals but as fellow travelers seeking understanding. Part 18. A modern awakening, renewed contact, ecumenism, and the slow softening of old divides. As the night deepens and the room around you settles into quiet, let your mind drift gently into the modern era, a time when the long-separated branches of Christianity, the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, begin to see one another not through the haze of past conflicts, but through the clearer, gentler light of renewed encounter. The centuries of distance did not erase their shared origins, nor did they erase the longing, however faint, for mutual understanding. And as the world changed, through travel, scholarship, and global communication, these two ancient traditions found themselves once again approaching one another with curiosity, humility, and a desire for healing. To enter this moment, imagine the world of the 19th century. It is a time of empires and revolutions, of steamships crossing oceans and railways stretching across continents. Scholars study ancient manuscripts with new tools. Diplomats travel between capitals. Missionaries visit lands their ancestors only read about. And for the first time in centuries, Catholics and Orthodox begin to encounter one another regularly, not as distant stories in a chronicle, but as living communities sharing villages, cities, and even family ties. Some of these encounters take place in Eastern Europe, where Catholic and Orthodox populations overlap. Others occur in the Middle East, where Latin Rite Christians and Eastern Christians live side by side. Still others happen in the great port cities of Western Europe, where immigrants from Greece, Russia, and the Balkans settle among Catholic populations. These interactions are often simple and human, neighbors meeting neighbors, clergy exchanging greetings, scholars attending conferences together. But behind these everyday moments lies a quiet shift, an awakening of awareness that the other tradition is not an abstract idea or rival, but a real, breathing community of faith. At the same time, scholarship begins to play a profound role in rediscovery. Western scholars pore over the writings of the Greek fathers, translating works that had long been unknown or underappreciated in the Latin world. Eastern scholars study Western theology with fresh eyes, sometimes surprised at how much depth they find, and how many misconceptions had lingered for centuries. This scholarly exchange reveals something gentle and profound: that both traditions, for all their differences, share far more common ground than anyone had fully realized. They share the same scripture, the same early councils, the same saints of the first millennium. Their differences, though real, are often matters of emphasis rather than outright contradiction. As global communication increases, misunderstandings that once took decades to correct can now be addressed in days. Where once language barriers created distance, new generations of bilingual scholars begin to act as bridges between East and West, translating not just words, but contexts, customs, and theological nuances. Yet the rapprochement of the modern era is not only intellectual. It is deeply personal and emotional, shaped by the tragedies and struggles of the 20th century. Imagine the world during the two world wars. Times of immense suffering when Christians of all traditions faced loss, violence, and displacement. Soldiers fought side by side. Families fled persecution together. Refugees found shelter in lands far from home. In these moments, denominational boundaries faded against the backdrop of shared human pain. Orthodox and Catholic believers prayed in the same trenches, wept in the same ruins, and mourned the same losses. These shared experiences created deep empathy. They reminded both traditions that before anything else, they were fellow human beings, united by compassion and the desire for peace. Then came the rise of totalitarian regimes, Soviet communism in the East, fascism in parts of Europe, and other oppressive systems that targeted Christians indiscriminately. Many Orthodox Christians endured severe persecution. Churches were closed. Clergy were imprisoned or killed. Monasteries were destroyed. In the West, Catholics watching these events felt a profound sense of solidarity and grief. The suffering of Orthodox Christians no longer seemed like a distant story, it was a painful, unfolding reality. During these dark decades, Catholic and Orthodox Christians often supported one another quietly, sometimes through humanitarian aid, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through simple messages of encouragement. These small gestures, though never dramatic enough to appear in history books, planted seeds of mutual respect. By the mid-20th century, a new atmosphere was taking shape, an atmosphere of dialogue. The Catholic Church entered a period of profound renewal through the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. Among its many goals was a desire for openness, communication, and reconciliation with other Christian traditions. For the first time in centuries, Catholic documents spoke warmly of the Orthodox churches, acknowledging the beauty and depth of their liturgy, their apostolic succession, their sacramental life, and their faithfulness to ancient tradition. Then, in 1964, a moment of historic tenderness occurred. In a meeting on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, two leaders embraced, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople. Their meeting was quiet, simple, and profoundly moving. They prayed together, spoke of healing, and expressed sorrow for the bitterness of the past. 1 year later, in 1965, they took a symbolic step that echoed across the Christian world. They lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054. While this did not restore full communion, it dissolved the symbolic barrier that had stood between East and West for 9 centuries. It was a gesture of humility, warmth, and hope. As you breathe softly, imagine that moment. Two elderly men, dressed in the robes of their traditions, standing side by side after centuries of separation. Their hands are clasped. Their voices tremble as they speak words of forgiveness. In that gentle space, the past does not disappear, but it loses its sharpness. Tension fades into compassion. Old grievances soften like wax in warm light. In the decades that follow, new dialogues begin. Commissions meet. Letters are exchanged. Pilgrims travel to one another's countries. Popes visit Orthodox monasteries. Patriarchs visit Rome. Theologians explore the roots of disagreement with fresh eyes, seeking not victory but understanding. And in all of this, ordinary believers continue to meet one another in daily life. A Catholic might attend an Orthodox wedding or funeral. An Orthodox family might befriend Catholic neighbors. In some countries, mixed marriages bring families from both traditions together around the same table. These experiences do not erase the schism, but they humanize the relationship, turning abstract differences into conversations between real people. Today, Catholic-Orthodox dialogue continues slowly but steadily. There is no rush, no pressure, no attempt to force unity. Instead, there is mutual respect and recognition of shared heritage. Both traditions honor the unity of the first millennium. Both express desire for reconciliation, though each moves carefully, respecting its identity and history. In this gentle illumination of the modern era, the Great Schism no longer feels like a chasm. It feels like a river crossed by bridges, bridges built of scholarship, compassion, humility, and prayer. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the two ancient trees once more. Their roots still touch beneath the soil. Their branches sway in different winds. Yet in the soft light of the modern world, new shoots grow between them, small, green, hopeful. Unity is not yet restored, but understanding is blossoming. In the next part of our series, we will explore the spiritual gifts each tradition treasures today, and how these gifts enrich the entire Christian world. Part 19. Gifts of the Spirit, the treasures Catholicism and Orthodoxy offer the world today. As you ease deeper into stillness, let your mind drift into the present day, where the long arc of history settles into a softer, quieter shape. The great dramas of councils, empires, crusades, and political upheavals are far behind us now, leaving in their place two ancient traditions, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, standing with dignity, resilience, and deep spiritual beauty. What was once a story of shared origins and eventually of separation is now also a story of gifts, traditions, and spiritual riches that continue to nourish millions of people across the world. In this quiet part of our journey, we will explore the unique strengths that each tradition has cultivated over centuries, strengths that do not oppose one another, but instead complement one another like two voices singing different harmonies of the same beloved song. As you breathe gently, imagine that you are strolling through a peaceful garden, where the blossoms represent practices, teachings, and values that have matured slowly, tended through centuries of devotion. Each blossom has its own fragrance, its own color, its own character. And together, they form a landscape of extraordinary spiritual depth. Begin with the Catholic tradition. Catholicism today is global in every sense. It stretches across continents and languages, from the chapels of Ireland to the cathedrals of France, from the basilicas of Italy to mission churches in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. One of its greatest strengths is this universality, the sense that the Catholic Church breathes with a global rhythm, carrying the stories and prayers of people from every corner of the world. This global presence is supported by a strong organizational structure, one that evolved slowly through centuries of pastoral need. The papacy, once a symbol of authority contested between East and West, has become, for Catholics, a unifying figure, a shepherd who guides the flock across nations and languages. While the Orthodox tradition values autonomy and local expression, Catholicism treasures unity of direction. This distinct approach offers stability, a consistent voice on matters of justice, compassion, and moral teaching. Another Catholic treasure lies in its intellectual tradition. The universities of the Middle Ages may feel distant now, but their legacy continues in countless Catholic institutions dedicated to education, research, and service. Theology in the West, shaped by thinkers like Augustine, Aquinas, Teresa of Avila, and John Paul II, builds sanctuaries of thought that are both structured and deeply spiritual. Western Christianity has a special gift for weaving faith with reason, showing believers that the mind and heart can work together to seek truth. This synergy has helped the Catholic world engage with science, philosophy, ethics, and culture in ways that resonate across centuries. Catholicism also carries a profound commitment to social justice. From hospitals and orphanages to international humanitarian efforts, Catholic organizations serve millions. Religious orders, Franciscans, Jesuits, Benedictines, Dominicans, live out charisms rooted in service, scholarship, simplicity, or contemplation. These vocations, though different, share a common thread of offering one's life for the good of others. In the modern world, where suffering and inequality remain, this commitment stands as a powerful witness. Now allow the scene in your mind to shift gently toward the East. Eastern Orthodoxy, though smaller globally, possesses treasures of remarkable spiritual depth, treasures preserved with devotion through centuries of change, struggle, and prayer. One of the most cherished gifts of the Orthodox tradition is its mystical theology. Where the West emphasizes clarity, the East emphasizes mystery. Not in the sense of obscurity, but in the sense of sacred wonder. Orthodoxy invites believers to encounter God not primarily through intellectual analysis, but through the experience of divine presence, cultivated through prayer, asceticism, and the liturgy. The Eastern liturgy itself is one of the most beautiful treasures in the Christian world. Enter an Orthodox church, and you step into a spiritual landscape shaped by incense, chant, iconography, and ancient hymns. The liturgy is not just a service, it is a living continuation of early Christian worship, carrying echoes of centuries of prayer. Icons, too, are a unique gift, not mere art, but theology in color, windows into heavenly realities, painted with prayerful reverence. Orthodoxy has preserved a strong monastic tradition that continues to thrive today. Places like Mount Athos, Mitura, and ancient monasteries in Serbia, Romania, Russia, and the Middle East are spiritual strongholds where silence, labor, and prayer form a rhythm older than empires. Monastic life in the Orthodox world is not cut off from the world, it stands as a lighthouse of prayer, illuminating the path for the faithful with simplicity, humility, and holiness. Another priceless contribution of Orthodoxy is its emphasis on theosis, the journey of becoming more united with God. This is not a concept of pride or self-elevation, but rather a gentle unfolding of the soul, shaped by grace. Theosis invites believers to become reflections of divine love, to be transformed gradually in heart and character through prayer and mercy. It offers a vision of Christian life that is not only moral but deeply participatory, calling believers into a lifelong process of spiritual growth. As you rest, imagine these two traditions not as rivals, but as two hands extended toward the same flame. The Catholic tradition holds one hand steadily, its fingers shaped by organization, scholarship, and global outreach. The Orthodox tradition holds the other, its fingers shaped by prayer, mystery, and sacred continuity. Each hand carries warmth and wisdom. Each hand reflects Christ in its own way. In the modern era, these gifts are not hidden away. Catholic scholars study Orthodox theology with curiosity and admiration. Orthodox theologians read Western Catholic authors with interest. Catholic monks learn practices from the Eastern Hesychast tradition. Orthodox choirs perform ancient chants that have moved Western listeners to tears. Catholics incorporate iconographic styles into their spiritual spaces. Orthodox communities appreciate the global humanitarian work of Catholics. The two traditions, though not fully united, are learning from one another again, softly, slowly, with patience. Their gifts are not mutually exclusive. They are complementary. And in this complementarity lies a gentle hope that the treasures each tradition preserves might enrich the entire Christian world, not through tension or pressure, but through shared appreciation. Imagine again the two great trees of Christianity. Their branches stretch in different directions, but beneath the soil their roots intertwine: Scripture, the early fathers, the creed, the sacraments, the memory of apostles who once walked together. The gifts that blossom from these rooted traditions, Catholic and Orthodox alike, are not meant to divide the world, but to illuminate it. In the next part of this sleep-friendly journey, we will explore how the modern world has brought new opportunities and new challenges for dialogue between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, moments of cooperation, moments of tension, and the quiet hope that unity, whether full or partial, can still grow between them. Part 20. Toward Tomorrow, Dialogue, Hope, and the Gentle Possibility of Reunion. As the night settles softly around you and your breath grows slow and steady, let your thoughts drift into the quiet light of the present and the soft, unfolding possibilities of the future. For nearly 1,000 years, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches have lived side by side, sometimes distant, sometimes curious, sometimes cautious, and sometimes tenderly hopeful. The long arc of their story is not merely one of separation. It is a story of memory, rediscovery, and a gradual awakening to how much they still share and how much they can still offer one another. This final chapter is not about doctrinal debate or historical grievance. It is about the gentle horizon ahead, the ways in which these two ancient branches of Christianity have begun to walk slowly, carefully, but sincerely toward a future shaped more by understanding than by old wounds. To begin, imagine the year as it stands today, with churches rising across continents, with believers praying in dozens of languages, with liturgies echoing in great urban cathedrals and small country chapels alike. The world has grown vast and unpredictable, filled with questions and needs that neither tradition can face alone. In this landscape, Catholics and Orthodox no longer view each other as distant strangers but as companions, fellow guardians of a heritage far older than the cities or nations that surround them. Consider the past century. After Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054, something delicate began to change, something like a soft thaw after a long winter. It was not loud. It was not urgent. It was simply warm. A gesture of humility, a willingness to let go of symbolic burdens, created space for new encounters. Papacy and Patriarchate exchanged visits. Encyclicals expressed mutual respect. Commissions began to meet quietly, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes simply for one honest conversation that clarified misunderstandings centuries old. These meetings were not dramatic. They were not designed to convince the world that unity would arrive overnight. They were moments of listening. Slow, careful, reverent listening. One by one, new relationships formed. When Pope John Paul II visited countries with large Orthodox populations, Greece, Romania, Ukraine, he did so with gentleness, bowing, listening, asking forgiveness for the past. Many Orthodox Christians responded with cautious warmth. Some wept. Some embraced. Others simply watched silently, unsure but open. It was the beginning of something quiet but real. A mutual recognition that the other tradition was not an enemy, but a sibling separated not by choice but by history. Then came new generations of theologians, Catholic, Orthodox, and scholars of both traditions, who worked patiently to revisit the questions that once caused such distress. The filioque, papal primacy, conciliar authority. These issues, once felt as sharp divides, were examined now with new knowledge of Greek and Latin context, new appreciation for cultural differences, and new respect for each tradition's internal logic. Many scholars discovered that the disagreements were not as absolute as once thought. Some were semantic. Some were linguistic. Some were shaped by political circumstances long gone. In this contemporary age, Catholics and Orthodox Christians increasingly pray for one another, celebrate one another's feast days, and admire the beauty of each other's traditions. Popes speak warmly of Orthodoxy's mystical depth. Patriarchs appreciate the Catholic commitment to global humanitarian work. Catholic monasteries learn from the Hesychast prayer of the East. Orthodox seminaries study the ethical and philosophical works of Western theologians. The relationship is not one of uniformity but of mutual enrichment. At the same time, both traditions face the same global challenges: secularization, shifting cultures, moral questions the early church could never have imagined, and the need to guide believers through a world that changes faster than any council can convene. These shared challenges create a sense of companionship, a subtle but powerful realization that they may need one another more than ever. If you listen closely to the voices of today's church leaders, you hear an undercurrent of longing, not for institutional merger, but for deeper communion, deeper understanding, deeper cooperation. Patriarchs meet popes with affection. Bishops exchange gifts. Joint prayers take place in cities touched by tragedy. Ecumenical dialogues continue quietly, steadily, without haste. Imagine now the two great trees we have pictured throughout this journey. Their branches, once spread far apart, now curve gently toward each other. Their leaves rustle in the same breeze. Birds fly between them, carrying seeds of thought and prayer. Their roots, once hidden deep underground, are now seen clearly as intertwined, fed by the same early saints, the same martyrs, the same gospel that once spread across united lands. The question of full reunion remains complex. Theological pathways must be explored with great care, humility, and patience. Both traditions value their autonomy, their identity, and the unique beauty of their liturgies and spiritual cultures. No one expects a sudden return to full communion. Unity, if it comes, will not arrive like a lightning strike. It will unfold like dawn, soft, gradual, impossible to pinpoint, yet unmistakable once it has come. Perhaps unity will not look like what anyone imagines. Perhaps it will be a unity of shared mission rather than shared governance. Perhaps it will be a unity of mutual recognition rather than structural merging. Perhaps it will be built not by councils, but by friendships, pilgrimages, dialogues, and the witness of communities who pray for one another. As you breathe deeply and feel your body grow heavier with rest, imagine Catholic and Orthodox believers lighting candles at the same moment in distant places. One in a quiet church in Athens, one in a small chapel in Poland, one in a wooden monastery in Serbia, one in a cathedral in Mexico City. Their candles flicker with the same hope. Their prayers rise toward the same God. Their hearts long for the same peace. In this final moment of our journey, remember that the story of the Great Schism is not merely a story of sorrow. It is also a story of endurance, rediscovery, and the slow but steady possibility of renewed closeness. Two ancient traditions once born from one church now stand as guardians of a shared treasure, a treasure of faith, reverence, prayer, and the memory of a time when East and West walked as one. Nothing in this story is rushed. Nothing is forced. It unfolds as gently as night turns toward morning. And as your eyes grow heavy and the world fades softly into quiet, hold this thought in your heart. The future of Catholic and Orthodox relations is not written in division. It is written in dialogue, understanding, and hope. When unity comes, if it comes, it will come not through power, but through love. Not through argument, but through humility. Not through urgency, but through time. And above all, it will come the same way healing always comes, softly. As we bring this long and peaceful journey to a close, let the stories of centuries past settle gently in your mind like evening light resting on the stones of an old cathedral. We have walked through the shared beginnings of East and West, through misunderstandings and moments of grace, through distant centuries shaped by scholars, saints, emperors, and ordinary believers. And now, at the end, what remains is not the memory of division but the quiet hope that understanding can grow slowly, tenderly, with patience. Thank you for resting with these histories and allowing their calm rhythms to guide you into stillness. Until our next journey together, may your night be peaceful and your dreams soft.